In the dead of winter, 1942, a U.S. cargo plane disappeared into Greenland's frozen silence. On November 5, 1942, the Douglas C-53 Sky Trooper went down on the vast ice cap, stranding 5 airmen in brutal Arctic conditions. For 148 days, the survivors would fight a nightmare of whiteouts, sub-zero cold, and hidden crevasses, a struggle that would require multiple rescue missions. Decades later, this ordeal would be chronicled in Frozen in Time and inspire a modern expedition to recover the remains of lost airmen. This is their story. November 1942. World War II rages across continents, and the Arctic is an unforgiving front. A routine cargo flight over Greenland has vanished into the ice. A search and rescue mission is launched, but disaster strikes again. A B-17 Flying Fortress, sent to find the missing plane, flies into a blinding whiteout and crashes onto the Greenland ice cap. Suddenly, 2 aircraft are down in the middle of nowhere, their crews at the mercy of the polar winter. The stakes could not be higher. Starvation, sub-zero temperatures, howling winds, and isolation prey on the survivors. Meanwhile, one rescue attempt after another falters or ends in tragedy, as if gremlins were sabotaging every lifeline. How long can these men hang on? Who, if anyone, will reach them in time? And what price will rescuers pay to bring them home from this frozen hell? These questions drive our story as we journey through a 40-minute saga of courage, endurance, and the indomitable will to survive against impossible odds. November 9th, 1942. Above the stark Greenland coast, a B-17F Flying Fortress designated PN-9E drones through turbulent skies. The bomber and its 9 crewmen have been diverted from their transatlantic ferry route to search for a missing C-53 transport plane. Below them stretches a limitless expanse of white, the Greenland ice cap, where the cargo plane disappeared days ago. The pilots squint out the cockpit. Everything is the same frightening shade of whitish gray. Sky and ground fuse into a disorienting haze. Inside the B-17, Lieutenant Armand Monteverde, the pilot, tightens his grip on the controls as the aircraft suddenly shudders. They've flown into a milk-white void, a cloud bank blending seamlessly with the snow-covered ice. With no horizon, Monteverde might as well be blind. He banks away instinctively, hoping to return to clearer air. But in an instant, the fortress's left wingtip snags something solid, the ground. A jarring crunch echoes through the fuselage as the massive plane slams onto the glacier. Metal screams and shatters. The B-17 skids roughly 200 yards over the ice before grinding to a halt. Silence, then groans of pain. Miraculously, all 9 men are alive, but the aircraft is torn open. The entire tail section has broken off and now dangles precariously over a gaping crevasse at the crash site. Another yawning chasm gapes just in front of the bomber's nose. They have crash-landed atop an active glacier riddled with hidden ice tunnels, as if marooned in the middle of a minefield. In the initial tally, 1 crewman's arm is broken, others suffer cuts and bruises, while a few emerge miraculously unhurt. Shocked and shivering, the men scramble out of the wreckage before something collapses. Lieutenant Monteverde and Lieutenant Harry Spencer, the co-pilot, quickly take stock. Lieutenant Bill O'Hara, the navigator, winces in pain. His feet are already numb from cold, boots soaked during the crash. The Arctic is asserting its claim. They all know that survival now depends on immediate action. The daylight is fading fast. In the high latitudes of Greenland, November days are brief. The wind howls across the ice, laced with stinging particles of snow. Monteverde realizes they can't stay exposed for long. The men salvage what they can from the wreck: sleeping bags, a few rations, a hand-crank radio transmitter, any tools or clothing. Using shards of aluminum and parachute cloth, they improvise shelter. For now, the shattered B-17 itself is their only refuge. They retreat into the less damaged forward fuselage section, cramming together for body heat. Through the night, Arctic winds shake the wreckage and temperatures plummet far below freezing. The crew's breath hangs in clouds as they huddle under whatever insulation they have, starting a vigil that will last far longer than any of them can imagine. Just a few days prior, On November 5, 1942, a U.S. Army Air Force C-53 Sky Trooper cargo plane had also met misfortune in Greenland. With 5 men aboard returning from a supply run to Europe, the C-53 radioed that it was making a forced landing on the ice cap amid engine trouble or severe weather. Its crew gave an approximate position on the desolate southeastern ice cap before all fell silent. For 2 nights, far off at a lonely coastal weather station, observers spotted distant flares, distress signals fired by the downed C-53 crew. Rescue teams attempted to reach them, venturing onto the ice with motorized sledges, but fierce conditions turned them back. A snowstorm and mechanical breakdowns thwarted their sleds, and the flares went dark. The C-53 and its 5 men seemed to vanish into the blizzard. By November 9th, when Monteverde's B-17 took off to help search, the fate of the C-53 was a chilling question mark. And now the would-be rescuers have become survivors of a crash themselves. Dawn after the B-17 crash brings only a bleak gray twilight. The crew of 9 awakens to the stark reality of their situation. They are alone on an ice cap larger than Texas. The radio operator, Corporal Lauren Lolly Howarth, sets up the emergency transmitter in the shattered fuselage and begins sending distress calls. At first, only static answers. The men's voices are hoarse and their faces drawn with cold, but they force down some of their scant provisions, canned rations from the B-17's survival kit, and plan next steps. In the distance, nothing but endless white. They name their crash site Snowball Camp, a dark joke on the Air Transport Command's nickname for the ferry route through Greenland, the Snowball Route. Over the next day, Howarth finally makes radio contact with a U.S. Army weather station located on the coast, known as Beachhead Station. Relief washes over the crew. At least others know they're alive. By November 10th, word of the B-17's plight reaches command posts. Plans are immediately set in motion to rescue the men, even as searchers still hope for signs of the missing C-53. But the weather has other ideas. A brutal storm system locks down the region with near-constant blizzards, grounding any immediate rescue flights. For days on end, the survivors at Snowball Camp endure blinding winds and searing cold, while rescue aircraft at the nearest base sit idle. Inside the wreck, time crawls. The Arctic winter is closing in. Each day the sun hangs lower, and soon polar night will enshroud them in darkness 24/7. The crew maintains a strict routine to keep despair at bay. They take turns stomping through the snow to check for any sign of a rescue party and to stretch their legs so they don't freeze in place. They clear snow off the fuselage to make their temporary home visible to search planes. Each evening they retreat under the B-17's wing or into its broken hull for shelter, wrapping themselves in parachute cloth and whatever insulation they can improvise. Despite their efforts, the cold is merciless. Fingers and toes go numb and waxy white with frostbite. Lieutenant O'Hara's feet, having gotten wet during the crash, are now freezing solid, a life-threatening situation if not resolved quickly. The men remove O'Hara's boots and are horrified to see his toes turn black. They do what they can, binding his feet, sharing their body heat, but deep down they know gangrene is a looming threat. After almost 2 weeks stranded, the weather finally breaks. On November 24th, 1942, the clouds lift enough for a reconnaissance flight. Cutting through the frigid air, a silver C-54 Skymaster, a military DC-4, appears, piloted by the famed Arctic aviator Colonel Bernd Balchen. Balchen is an experienced polar explorer leading the U.S. search and rescue operations in Greenland. Risking the fickle weather, he flies out of Bluey West 8, Sondre Stromfjord, and tirelessly scans the whiteness below. Finally, he spots a dark shape on the ice, the wreck of PN-9E. Circling low, Balchen's crew can see movement, survivors. A jolt of joy courses through the stranded men as the big 4-engine plane soars overhead. They scramble out and wave furiously. Balchen radios the position to base. The B-17 is approximately 40 miles inland from the coast, sitting on a crevasse-riddled glacier in southeast Greenland. Immediately, plans kick into high gear. With weather temporarily clear, airdropping supplies is the first priority. That very day, Balchen's C-54 returns to make a daring supply drop. The B-17 crew watches as the Skymaster swoops low and parachutes tumble out, blossoming against the gray sky. Crates thud onto the ice, food, fuel, winter clothing, medicine, a lifeline from above. The men cheer and rush to gather the canisters before the glacier's many crevasses can swallow them. At last, they have mittens and parkas, more canned rations, even treats like chocolate and instant coffee to lift their spirits. Night arrives, and with it, the first stars of the polar winter. But now, a flicker of hope has been kindled. Over their crackling radio, the survivors hear that a rescue team is coming. As they divvy up a hot meal of ration stew heated on a small stove fueled by aircraft fuel, they allow themselves a rare luxury: optimism. Each man silently imagines being home by Christmas. Outside, the Arctic night is vast and dark, but for the first time, they do not feel completely alone. Even as the B-17 crew's spirits lift, elsewhere in Greenland more trouble brews. The region has seemingly become a Bermuda Triangle of the Arctic. In addition to the missing C-53 and the downed B-17, yet another aircraft falls victim to the elements. An RAF twin-engine, Douglas Havoc, being ferried by a Canadian crew, gets lost in a snowstorm and is forced to land on the ice cap with empty fuel tanks. Though the Havoc's crew survives the landing, they are now stranded too. Thankfully, their ordeal is brief. They set out on foot and within days are found and rescued by a Coast Guard team from the cutter Northland that followed their trail of makeshift snowshoe tracks. By late November, Greenland's frozen wilderness has ensnared at least 3 aircraft. Bad things come in threes, people say, but in Greenland, bad luck seems boundless. The string of crashes and disappearances has airmen whispering about gremlins. In World War II lore, gremlins are the mischievous spirits blamed when aircraft malfunction for no reason. Surely, some joke grimly, gremlins must be lurking on this ice cap, dooming each rescue attempt as if the land itself is cursed. The B-17 crew, fighting off fear in their frozen shelter, hear occasional radio news of these events. They learn the Havoc men are safe, a relief tempered by the knowledge that their own rescue is proving far more difficult. If anything, the dangers surrounding them have multiplied. Now commanding the broader rescue operation, Colonel Balkin strategizes a multi-pronged effort. He has limited daylight and increasingly savage weather to contend with. Balchin knows that trying to land a large airplane near the crash site is extremely risky, but smaller aircraft might manage it. He requests the assistance of the U.S. Coast Guard, which has a ship patrolling Greenland's coastal waters equipped with a small rescue plane, a Grumman J 2 F-4 Duck amphibious biplane. Aboard the cutter USCGC Northland, Lieutenant John Pritchard and radioman Benjamin Bottoms stand ready with their diminutive Duck. These two men have already proven themselves heroes. Just days earlier, on November 23rd, Pritchard led a daring night climb on foot to rescue 3 downed Canadian flyers on the ice cap, for which he earned a Navy and Marine Corps medal. Now, Pritchard and Bottoms prepare to risk everything again to save the Americans of PN-9E. Morning of November 28, 1942. The Arctic dawn is a mere dim glow as the crew of the Northland hoists the Duck over the side and onto icy water. Braving freezing spray and gusting winds, Lieutenant Pritchard and Petty Officer 1 Bottoms throttle up the Duck's engine and take off, disappearing inland toward the crash site. In the B-17 camp, it's another frigid day of waiting. The men stomp their feet and swing their arms to fend off frostbite. Around mid-morning, the drone of an aircraft engine echoes over the ice. The Duck is approaching. Spotting the B-17's blackened wreck, Pritchard carefully overflies it to scout a landing spot. Radioing down, Pritchard asks Monteverde for any advice on where to land. Corporal Howarth, manning the handheld radio on the ground, warns him of the countless crevasses. "Don't try it. Crevasses everywhere." But Pritchard has already spotted a seemingly smooth, gently sloped area about a mile north of the wreck. With consummate skill, he brings the Duck in low. Instead of using the landing gear, which could snag in the snow, he decides to use the plane's central flotation pontoon as an improvised ski. The bright yellow Duck touches down on the open snow, skids uphill, and miraculously comes to a safe stop. It is the first successful landing on Greenland's ice-capped surface by any airplane. Pritchard and Bottoms have achieved the impossible. The B-17 survivors whoop with joy and scramble to meet their saviors. Monteverde and Spencer help two of the weaker crewmen, the walking wounded, prepare to evacuate first. They choose the crew members who can still hobble through the snow but are suffering from injuries, likely the man with the broken arm and another with severe frostbite. Everyone knows the small duck can only take a couple of passengers at a time. Pritchard and Bottoms arrive at the B-17 after a laborious 2-mile hike, carefully probing the ice with a broomstick to avoid hidden crevasses. When the survivors see the Coast Guardsmen trudging toward them, rugged and determined, some break into relieved laughter. Others fight back tears. Rescue is finally at hand. At the crash site, Pritchard quickly but calmly introduces himself. He informs Monteverde that he can shuttle the crew out 2 at a time, making multiple trips as needed. Without wasting time, they all trek back across the ice toward the duck, escorting the first 2 evacuees. The process is arduous. The snow conceals deep cracks in the glacier, and every step must be tested. But by afternoon, Pritchard, Bottoms, and the 2 chosen airmen reach the duck safely and cram into its tiny cabin. Pritchard decides on an unorthodox takeoff. He and Bottoms had earlier shoveled snow away from the duck's landing gear and manually retracted the wheels so the plane can slide on its belly. Now, with everyone aboard, he points the nose downhill on the slope he landed. The duck's engine roars to life, the little plane skimming over the snow and lifting off just before the terrain drops away. Against the odds, Pritchard's first extraction is a success. Back on the Northland cutter that evening, the crew watches anxiously as dusk falls. Suddenly, the duck appears out of the gloom, navigating by the ship's powerful searchlights. The first 2 B-17 crewmen are brought aboard to warmth and safety. They are exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. As the ship's doctor tends to them, one man murmurs through chattering teeth about the comrades still on the ice. He knows Pritchard will go back for the others. He has to. There are 7 men still stranded at Snowball Camp, including the badly injured navigator O'Hara. That night, on the ice cap, Monteverde's group is jubilant that 2 of their brothers have been saved. Spirits soar higher when the survivors learn via radio that the duck will return the next morning to get more of them out. They spend the night making careful plans. Who should go next, how to assist O'Hara, whose legs are now in grave condition, and how to break camp once rescue is complete. In the darkness, one of them scribbles in a diary that November 29th just might be the day they all cheat death. November 29th, 1942. At first light, Pritchard and Bottoms are already airborne, determined to evacuate as many of the remaining men as possible before an approaching storm arrives. On the ice, the B-17 crew pack their meager belongings and prepare O'Hara for transport, fashioning a rough sled to pull him since he can't walk. Unknown to them, help is also converging overland. An Army rescue party with 2 motorized sledges has been inching its way toward the crash site for days. This morning, by sheer coincidence, the Army sled team reaches the vicinity almost exactly when the duck comes in to land again. As Pritchard brings the duck down, this time intentionally belly landing it on the snow without extending the landing gear, the men at Snowball Camp spot movement on the horizon. One of the Army's Weasel motor sleds emerges, chugging toward them. But before the survivors can even cheer, disaster strikes. The Second Army sled behind the first suddenly plunges through the snow. It hits a hidden crevasse. An ice bridge collapses under its weight. In an instant, the vehicle and its driver are swallowed by a bottomless fissure, vanishing without a trace. The sole remaining Army rescuer stops, horrified and helpless. One of his comrades is just gone. He radios an emergency report of the accident. The men at the B-17 freeze in shock at this grim reminder of the glacier's deadly unpredictability. Fog is now rolling in fast, the weather turning on a dime. Lieutenant Monteverde realizes the situation is deteriorating and urges haste. He sends Corporal Howarth, the radio man, to run to the duck's landing site and warn Pritchard, "Get out while you can." The fog threatens to strand everyone if they delay. Howarth dashes off and meets Pritchard and Bottoms coming from their plane. He delivers Monteverde's urgent plea to evacuate immediately. With visibility dropping by the minute, Pritchard faces an agonizing decision whom to take on this flight. He had hoped to ferry 2 men at a time again, but with the encroaching storm, it's clear this may be the last chance for a while. Lieutenant O'Hara is in critical shape, but moving him in these conditions could be fatal if the Duck can't take off. Monteverde and the others watch from a distance, praying for a safe escape. Time is up. Pritchard decides to depart with 1 passenger this trip to maximize the Duck's odds of getting airborne in the thickening fog. Corporal Lolly Howarth, having carried the message, is right there with them, and possibly Pritchard feels the young radioman will be an asset on board given the treacherous weather. Alternatively, perhaps Howarth, exhausted and frostbitten, begs to go. In any case, Pritchard, Bottoms, and Howarth climb into the Duck for the return to the cutter. On the ground, Monteverde's heart sinks to see only one of his men leaving, but he steels himself, knowing the rest must hold out longer. He waves bravely as the Duck's engine revs. In swirling snow, the little biplane lifts off the ice and disappears into low cloud almost immediately. The remaining 6 survivors, Monteverde, Spencer, O'Hara, and Private Spina, Tucciaroni, and Puryear, or Best, retreat to their camp with the lone Army rescuer, nerves on edge. They strain to hear the Duck's engine fade away. Minutes pass. The radio at Beachhead Station crackles with a transmission from radioman Bottoms on the Duck, growing fainter. The fog has swallowed them. Conditions are deteriorating. Then, nothing. Repeated calls to Pritchard's plane go unanswered. The Duck never arrives back at the Northland. Sometime on that deadly morning of November 29th, flying blind in a milk-white blizzard, Pritchard's Duck crashes into the glacier. All 3 aboard, Lieutenant Pritchard, P.O.1 Bottoms, and Corporal Howarth, are killed on impact. They gave their lives in service of the rescue. When this devastating news reaches the remaining B-17 crew by radio, the effect is shattering. Monteverde and his men had thought salvation was near. Instead, they have lost one of their own, their beloved radio operator, and the 2 Coast Guard heroes who risked everything for them. For a second time, the rescuers have become victims. A heavy pall of grief and despair descends on Snowball Camp. To make matters worse, the weather rages with renewed fury, halting any further air rescue attempts. Blizzards pound the glacier for days as if the very elements were furious. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard cutter Northland and Army units launch searches for the lost Duck, but in the chaotic ice fields, their efforts yield nothing. The crash site of the Duck is spotted from the air a month later, a crumpled speck half buried in snow, but recovering the bodies is deemed too dangerous. Pritchard and Bottoms would remain forever entombed in Greenland's ice, becoming the Coast Guard's only MIAs from World War II. The surviving B-17 crew, hearing of this, know that their own chances for a quick rescue just dimmed significantly. As December 1942 deepens, the 6 airmen still stranded face their grimmest period. The sun disappears below the horizon for weeks on end. In perpetual darkness and merciless cold, they endure what seems like an endless Arctic night. Gale force winds up to 125 miles per hour scream over their camp. On several occasions, resupply aircraft try to drop parachutes with food and fuel, but high winds send the canisters wildly off target. The men venture out after each storm to scavenge what they can. Some supplies are retrieved, others vanish down crevasses in plain sight. Hunger becomes a constant companion. Though additional rations were delivered, the men carefully conserve every calorie. They supplement the canned meat with whatever they have, even boiling clean shreds of leather from a spare boot, just to have something warm in their stomachs. Frostbite worsens, especially for Lieutenant O'Hara. Both of O'Hara's legs are now severely infected with gangrene from prolonged freezing. The odor of necrosis permeates the little shelter, and his crewmates do their best to clean and bandage his blackened feet each day. They fear that without amputation, O'Hara will die. But of course, surgery on a glacier is impossible. The men take turns boosting each other's morale. Sergeant Woody Puryear cracks jokes about the tropical vacation they'll take after this. Tech Sergeant Alfred Clint Best leads impromptu prayers on Sundays. Co-pilot Harry Spencer, a natural joker, keeps spirits up by talking about home-cooked meals and warm beds waiting for them. In quieter moments, some of the crew scribble farewell letters to loved ones, which they keep tucked in their pockets, just in case. Rescue attempts continue in fits and starts. In mid-December, the U.S. Army hires a renowned Canadian bush pilot to fly a Barclay Gros T-8P-1 ski plane into the fray. This odd twin-engine craft heads out from Bluey West, one loaded with hopes, but it encounters a brutal headwind and runs out of fuel, crash landing on a fjord ice not far from the coast. The pilot and navigator survive and manage to hike to safety, but the plane is lost. Another rescue plane down. By New Year's, no fewer than 5 aircraft have been wrecked in connection with this saga. The C-53, the B-17, the RAF Havoc, the Grumman Duck, and now the Barclay Gros. Greenland's deadly grip seems to tighten with each attempt. The gremlins must be laughing at us, one rescue coordinator muses grimly as yet another plan is formulated. Through January 1943, Colonel Balkin relentlessly pushes for a solution. He requests the Navy's workhorse seaplanes, the PBY Catalina flying boats, believing they might do what nothing else has, land on the ice and take off again. It takes weeks of lobbying. The PBYs are desperately needed for anti-submarine patrols in the North Atlantic. But finally, the Navy agrees to loan 2 Catalinas for the rescue on the condition that Balkin himself oversees the landings. Modification and prep take time. The Catalinas will attempt something unprecedented, to belly land on the ice cap using their amphibious hulls as giant sleds, much as Pritchard did with the Duck. While these plans develop, ground parties make renewed efforts. An Army sledge patrol, including experienced Inuit dog handlers from the local sledge patrol, tries multiple forays toward Snowball Camp. They are beaten back by blizzards each time. One small victory. A dog sled team finally reaches and rescues the sole Army man who survived the November crevasse accident. He had stayed with the B-17 crew for a time, assisting as he could, but eventually he set out back toward the coast and was picked up. Now, the weather rescue station at Beachhead becomes the staging point for what comes next. Inside the makeshift shelter under the B-17's wing, the remaining crew grows weaker. They have now been on the glacier for 2 months, and their bodies are failing from malnutrition and cold. Simple tasks, like cutting blocks of snow to build a windbreak, leave them exhausted. Sleep is fitful, haunted by nightmares of never waking up, yet they persevere, motivated by each other's presence. They refuse to let their friend O'Hara die. In late January, as his condition worsens, Monteverde decides it's time to move O'Hara closer to the coast, even if no rescue has arrived yet. Perhaps they can meet the rescue team halfway. They place the gaunt navigator, who has lost nearly 2/3 of his body weight, down from 180 to about 60 pounds, onto the remaining Army motor sled. In early February, on a rare clear day, 2 of the strongest crewmen volunteer to sled O'Hara toward Beachhead Station. It is a desperate gambit born out of love for their brother. Monteverde and the others see them off, hoping to reunite at the coast. But fate intervenes once more. Barely a mile from camp, the sled crosses a fragile snow bridge which collapses, sending one of the men tumbling into a crevasse to his death. The remaining escort, now alone with O'Hara, cannot continue forward nor safely return to the B-17. Stranded on the open ice, he sets up a canvas tent, drags O'Hara inside, and hunkers down, hoping help will find them before the unrelenting cold claims them both. By now, the tragedy of this mission has compounded beyond imagination. 5 lives have been lost in the rescue effort, 3 in the Duck and 2 in the ice, the Army driver and the sledding crewman. The men still waiting at Snowball Camp, Monteverde, Spencer, and the 2 remaining enlisted crew, likely Spina and either Best or Puryear, know they are all on borrowed time. It is February 1943, and they have weathered the worst of winter, but they are barely hanging on. February 5th, 1943. At long last, a breakthrough. Colonel Balkin pilots a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina through a narrow window of clear weather and finds the tiny tent housing Lieutenant O'Hara and his escort on the ice cap. These 2 men have been living in that flimsy tent for over a week, burning a small stove and rationing the last of the emergency chocolate. O'Hara is barely conscious, his feet are essentially mummified. The escorting crewman is exhausted and frostbitten, but alive, ever vigilant at his friend's side. When the giant flying boat appears overhead, they can hardly believe it's real. Balchin knows landing a Catalina here is perilous, but he also knows this may be the only chance to save O'Hara's life. With consummate skill, he brings the PBY down, belly landing on the ice near the tent in a controlled skid. The big aircraft's metal hull screeches as it meets the snow, sliding to a halt not far from the stranded pair. A cheer rises from the Catalina's crew. Rescuers jump out and rush to the tent, faces wrapped in fur-lined hoods. They find O'Hara delirious and the other man weak but overjoyed to see them. In moments, they are carried into the PBY's hull. One rescuer grimly notes that O'Hara's feet have frozen solid. In fact, his toes have begun to detach due to frostbite. They carefully bundle him, trying not to do further harm. As the Catalina crew loads the survivors, a new problem arises. The PBY's hull has begun to freeze to the ice. In the short time since landing, the intense cold effectively cemented the plane in place. The engines strain. The flying boat refuses to budge. For a tense hour, Balchin and his men rock the aircraft using its wingtip floats, chipping away ice and revving the throttles. At last, with a crack, the hull breaks free. Balchin taxis the PBY in a wide circle, keeping momentum so it doesn't freeze again, while the crewmen still outside literally run alongside and clamber in through a side blister as it moves. In a cloud of snow, the Catalina powers up and lifts off the ice, carrying O'Hara and his escort to safety. Against all odds, 2 more of the lost crew are now rescued. Balchin's success electrifies the whole rescue operation. The remaining 3 men at the main B-17 camp are now the last ones unaccounted for. They have survived nearly 3 months on the glacier by this point, a feat of endurance practically unheard of. They are weak, frostbitten, and one of them can barely walk, but they are alive and still waiting. Balchin is determined to get them out. In mid-March 1943, as the Arctic begins to lighten with the approaching spring, Balchin flies another PBY, or possibly the same one, repaired and refueled, back to the ice cap. This time, he carries a specialized rescue team with dog sleds and Inuit handlers to retrieve the final trio from Snowball Camp. On March 17th, the Catalina once again belly lands on the ice near the coordinates of the old motorsled camp, a location they've used as a forward staging area. From here, the B-17 wreck is about 6 miles away across treacherous terrain. Balchin offloads a 3-man sled team and 9 hardy sled dogs onto the ice. The airmen of Snowball Camp see none of this. They are huddled in their wing shelter, unaware that help is moving towards them on the ground at last. For the next 3 days, the rescue sled team fights through the ice field to reach the crash site. Heavy snowfall and drifting have almost completely buried the B-17 by now. Only part of a wing and the nose blister poke out from a mound of snow. Inside, Lieutenant Monteverdi, Lieutenant Spencer, and their last enlisted crewmate, likely Sergeant Puryear or Sergeant Best, lie in a semi-stupor, conserving energy. Frostbite has claimed several fingers among them. All are gaunt and hollow-eyed. They have been surviving on half rations and sheer willpower. When a voice suddenly calls out from the distance, human voices, at first they think it's another hallucination, but then the barking of sled dogs echoes through the still air. Monteverdi, summoning strength he didn't know remained, crawls out and to his amazement sees figures approaching, men in parkas leading dog sleds, waving and yelling a greeting. Rescue has finally reached Snowball Camp. The scene that unfolds is deeply emotional. The hardened rescuers embrace the survivors, astonished that they are even alive. Tears freeze on cheeks. Spencer, ever the joker, musters a grin and quips, "Took you long enough," before collapsing into the arms of a rescuer. In truth, these airmen are barely clinging to life. The rescue team immediately gives them hot broth and begins evacuating them by sled back to the PBY landing site. Over rough icy terrain, it takes another couple of days to shuttle the weakened men on dog sleds. The rescuers handle them with great care, mindful that even a small injury or exposure could be fatal in their condition. Finally, by early April 1943, the last of the B-17 crew reached the Catalina camp. Colonel Balchin has been waiting for them, keeping the PBY warmed and ready. He greets Monteverde, Spencer, and the third survivor with a broad smile and perhaps moist eyes. These men are coming home after an Arctic odyssey of epic length. On April 6, 1943, Balchin's Catalina attempts takeoff with all survivors and the rescue team aboard, but the plane groans under the weight on the softening spring snow. One engine sputters and fails. The overloaded aircraft cannot lift. Rather than risk another crash, they offload everyone except the flight crew and the 3 B-17 survivors. Balchin himself, along with the sled team members, volunteer to stay behind. He assures the rescued airmen that he'll see them back at base, even if he has to walk there. The Catalina then revs up again, and carrying only its own crew and the 3 survivors, manages to get airborne on April 7th. As the big flying boat disappears toward Bluey West 1, the last of the stranded airmen are finally leaving the ice cap. Balchin and the remaining rescue party are not out of danger yet. They now must trek on foot and sled over 30 miles to the nearest outpost. But these are hardy Arctic experts, and under Balchin's leadership they set off confidently. About 9 days later, on April 16th, Balchin and his team arrive safely at Beachhead Station, frost-nipped and tired but triumphant. The 148-day nightmare is over. One of the longest and most challenging airman survival ordeals in history has ended in survival and success. Of the original 9 B-17 crew, all 6 who remained at Snowball Camp made it out alive against all odds. The cost, however, was staggering. The effort to save these men became one of the most extensive search and rescue operations ever attempted. It claimed 5 aircraft, the C-53 and B-17 that started it all, plus 3 rescue planes, the Coast Guard Duck, the Barclay Grow, and a Coast Guard Twin Beach. And 5 brave men lost their lives. Among the fallen were Lieutenant John Pritchard and Petty Officer 1 Ben Bottoms, who gave their lives on a selfless rescue flight, and Corporal Lorne Lolly Howarth, the radio man who survived a bomber crash only to perish in a second crash trying to escape. 2 others died in the icy depths of crevasses. These sacrifices underscore the brutal truth. In Greenland's war against the elements, even heroes can pay the ultimate price. Thank you for watching Frozen in Time, Gremlins, and Arctic Survival. If this incredible true story moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true survival stories and historical documentaries. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe. July 30th, 1945. Pitch black night in the Philippine Sea. Hundreds of sailors bob in the oil-slick water, clinging to scraps of debris. All around them, dorsal fins cut the surface. Every few minutes, a scream pierces the darkness and then abruptly stops. This is no horror movie. It's the real nightmare faced by the crew of the USS Indianapolis. Torpedoed at midnight, their ship vanished in 12 minutes. Nearly 900 men now drift helplessly under a moonless sky in shark-infested waters. Over the next 4 days, they will endure a trial of unimaginable horror, relentless shark attacks, brutal exposure, thirst, madness, before a chance rescue plucks the few survivors from the sea. Only 316 out of the 1,195 men who sailed on Indianapolis survived to tell the tale. How did this tragedy happen, and what does it reveal about survival, accountability, and the human spirit? To understand how the sailors of Indianapolis came to be stranded in a living nightmare, we must go back to the waning days of World War II. In mid-July 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was on a top-secret mission. The ship had raced from San Francisco to the Pacific island of Tinian, carrying precious cargo, components of Little Boy, the first atomic bomb used in combat. The crew themselves had no idea what they were delivering, only that armed Marines guarded a mysterious crate in the hangar. Indianapolis set a speed record to Pearl Harbor and arrived at Tinian on July 26th, completing its secret mission in record time. With the cargo safely delivered, Captain Charles B. McVeigh III received new orders: proceed to Guam, then on to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to join the fleet for expected invasion operations. The war was nearly over, but the sea was still dangerous. On July 28th, Indianapolis departed Guam alone, unescorted, steaming west toward Leyte. Captain McVeigh, following standard orders, zigzagged at his discretion to evade submarines, until night fell under heavy clouds, when he ceased zigzagging due to poor visibility. Unknown to him, a Japanese submarine, I-58, was lurking in the area. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of Tharn 58 spotted the silhouette of a large American warship just after midnight on July 30th. In the calm darkness, Hashimoto maneuvered into attack position, and at 23:56 on July 29th, by the ship's log shortly after midnight July 30th, he fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the unsuspecting cruiser. The fate of Indianapolis was sealed in that moment, even though her crew wouldn't realize it for a few seconds more. A little after 0:14 a.m. on July 30th, the first torpedo slammed into Indianapolis's starboard bow. The explosion blew the bow open in a thunderous blast, killing dozens of sleeping men instantly in the forward compartments. Seconds later, a second torpedo struck near the middle of the ship, right by the powder magazine and fuel tanks. A maelstrom of fire and shrapnel ripped through the cruiser as aviation fuel ignited in a chain of explosions. The massive ship literally split to its keel. Within moments, Indianapolis was mortally wounded and began to list heavily. "We knew we were in trouble," recalled Ensign Harlan Twible, a 22-year-old officer. With the bridge in chaos and no official order given, Twible took charge and shouted, "Abandon ship, follow me." He leapt into the ocean, and hundreds of sailors followed, swarming off the decks into the sea as the ship's bow sank deeper. Inside the failing vessel, Chief Warrant Officer Leonard Woods remained at his radio post, desperately attempting to send an SOS distress signal even as water surged in. Indianapolis had lost all power, and its communications were down, but still Woods tapped out a mayday into the void while the ship was tilting crazily beneath his feet. Within just 12 minutes of the first hit, the proud cruiser rolled completely onto her side. Sailors clung to rails that were now nearly horizontal. Captain McVeigh stayed on the bridge until the last possible moment, helping as many men as he could, before climbing out and walking along the hull as his ship capsized. At 0:25 to 0:27, USS Indianapolis's stern rose briefly out of the water, and then the ship slid under the waves, disappearing into the black depths of the Philippine Sea. Approximately 300 men went down with the Indianapolis in those first minutes, killed by the blasts, trapped below decks, or unable to escape the sinking hull. But miraculously, about 900 crew, the majority, survived the initial sinking and found themselves flung into an endless ocean. It was shortly after midnight, and the sea was chaotic with debris, oil, and thrashing men. Many sailors, including Twible, were wounded or burned from the explosions. Coated head to toe in thick fuel oil, they tried to wipe burning diesel from their eyes and mouths. Some men had life jackets, but many did not. In the darkness, small groups of survivors began calling out to each other, gathering around whatever could float, a few half-inflated life rafts, floater nets, or simply clusters of men in life vests clinging to one another. Initially, there was shock and disbelief, but also hope. The men were certain that the Navy would realize Indianapolis was in trouble and send rescue by morning. After all, the ship had gone down so fast that hardly any formal distress call got out, but surely someone would notice the missed check-ins or pick up a mayday. In those first hours, adrift in darkness, many of the crew remained relatively calm, encouraging each other that they just had to survive until daylight. Everybody was scared to death, Twible admitted, but there wasn't any fighting, any turmoil, initially. Little did they know that a chain of errors and oversights in Navy communications would mean no one was coming, not for a long while. The survivors were utterly alone, 280 miles from the nearest land, castaways in an unforgiving sea. When dawn broke on the first day, July 30th, the men of Indianapolis faced their predicament in stark clarity. In the merciless light of tropical sun, they could see hundreds of their shipmates spread across miles of open water. Some were badly injured, bleeding, burned, or with broken limbs. All were covered in black oil from the ship's fuel tanks, which left an iridescent slick stretching to the horizon. Ensign Twible, one of the highest-ranking survivors, immediately tried to impose order. He organized the roughly 325 men nearest him into a group, the largest of several clusters of survivors. Throughout the morning, these men lashed themselves together with belts and lines or held onto a few floater nets to avoid drifting apart. Twible instituted shark watches, posting men at the edges of their group to kick and punch at any unwelcome visitors and keep everyone close together. They had already glimpsed dark shapes circling below. The ocean's most feared predators were starting to arrive. As the sun climbed high, the heat became torment. The Philippine Sea offered no shade and soon turned oppressively hot, like a mirror reflecting blinding light onto the bobbing sailors. It was like having your head in the middle of a mirror, remembered Signalman Third Class Paul McGinnis, describing the sun's brutal intensity. Men's exposed skin blistered and burned under the tropical sun. The ocean's surface heated up, making them sweat, but the nights would be the opposite, cold and shivering. Dehydration set in quickly. Floating in salt water under a tropical sun, the survivors became desperately thirsty within hours. They had almost no food or fresh water. Indianapolis had sunk so swiftly that there had been no time to deploy life rafts stocked with provisions. A few men managed to grab canteens or found crates of provisions that bobbed to the surface. One Marine, Edgar Harrell, stumbled across a crate of potatoes in the wreckage, but they were rotten through. I peeled the skin back as far as I could and squeezed the potato to get a little piece, he said of his meager find. Others shared a few crackers or cans of Spam scavenged from floating debris. These scant rations were nowhere near enough. By the end of the first day, many survivors' lips were cracked and tongues swollen from thirst. And then there were the sharks. Initially, the predators took those on the periphery. Survivors in the water would suddenly hear a blood-chilling scream and a frantic splashing, and they'd turn to see a thrashing body or a red bloom spreading in the blue sea. The oceanic white-tip shark, an aggressive species common in those waters, had arrived in droves. Tiger sharks, too, may have joined the feeding frenzy. At first, the sharks feasted on the dead bodies floating in the area. There were many. But as time went on, the hundreds of sharks became bolder and began attacking the living. All the time, the sharks never let up, remembered Boatsian's mate Second Class Eugene Morgan, one of the survivors. Morgan and about 14 others were clinging to a large cargo net with flotation buoys. Suddenly, as he described, 10 sharks hit it and there was nothing left. The entire group of men on that net was devoured in seconds. This went on and on and on, he said grimly. Men in the water tried to maintain tight circles, lashing their legs together or huddling back to back, kicking and shouting to ward off attacks as if forming a human fort. It helped. Sharks are less likely to attack a tight group, but whenever someone drifted away from a group or floated off alone in delirium, the sharks would seize the opportunity. By the second day, July 31st, hope was turning to despair. Many of the men expected rescue ships or planes to arrive by now, but the horizon remained empty. What the survivors did not know was that multiple errors back at Naval Headquarters had left Indianapolis's disappearance unnoticed. No one in the Navy even realized the ship was missing. As the hours crawled by, the ordeal began to take a psychological toll. The combination of severe dehydration, exposure, and traumatic stress was driving some sailors into hallucinations and madness. Machinist's mate, Second Class Granville Crane, recalled how men who drank salt water went insane. They'd be so crazy, they'd be fighting amongst themselves and killing one another. In the throes of saltwater delirium, some men imagined fantastic sights. Crane described men seeing things that weren't there. They'd say, "The Indy is down below, and they're giving out fresh water and food in the galley," and they'd swim down, and a shark would get them. In these hallucinations, a mirage of salvation lured sailors to literally dive to their deaths. Comrades watched, helpless and horrified, as sharks circled below and picked them off one by one. Hallucinations could spread like a contagion through the desperate men. In one large group, a survivor began babbling that he had found the stern of the sunken ship just beneath them, intact and full of fresh milk and water. Delirious with thirst, some men believed him. One by one, they slipped off their life jackets and dove below the surface in search of an imaginary galley, and never came back up. Others became paranoid or violent, armed with knives or bits of wreckage. Crazed sailors sometimes turned on their own friends, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. Friendly fire incidents occurred as delirious men imagined their shipmates were Japanese soldiers attacking them. The psychological trauma was as dangerous as the sharks. Those still sane did their best to keep their comrades awake and oriented, talking, praying, slapping those who started to drift into stupor or delusion. But with each passing hour, fewer and fewer men remained alive and lucid. Night brought temporary relief from the sun, but introduced new agonies. When darkness fell on those interminable nights, the ocean turned cold. Men in the water had little insulation. Soaked through and exhausted, they began to shiver uncontrollably in the tropical night air. Many succumbed to hypothermia, losing consciousness and slipping under, never to wake. Others simply drifted away in the darkness without anyone noticing until daylight. Throughout those nights, the survivors huddled together for warmth and comfort. Some sang hymns or softly prayed, their voices carrying over the dark water. Others could only listen to the endless splashing and the occasional horrifying thud of a shark strike in the blackness, followed by screams. Ensign Twible's group worked to maintain morale. He led prayers and repeatedly assured his men that they would be rescued, though privately he doubted anyone would come in time. Twible took drastic steps to preserve his men's will to live. Whenever a man died, Twible ordered that the body be untied from the group and set adrift. The survivors grimly pushed their fallen friends away into the darkness. It was an agonizing decision, but necessary. Keeping the corpses nearby not only attracted more sharks, but served as a constant demoralizing reminder of their own likely fate. They had to focus on surviving until help arrived. If they had known that help would not arrive for days, perhaps many more would have lost hope, but hope, however thin, was all they had. By the third and fourth days, August 1st and 2nd, the sea had become a graveyard. By Thursday morning, August 2nd, the dead outnumbered the living, notes one account starkly. Of the approximately 900 men who entered the water, hundreds had already perished from their wounds, drowned, or been eaten by sharks. Many others were alive but in critical condition, barely clinging to life on sheer willpower. A Navy report later estimated that the majority of those lost had actually died of exposure, dehydration, or saltwater poisoning, not shark attack. Still, survivors would forever remember the terror of the circling sharks as a defining horror of their experience. It is likely the worst instance of sharks feeding on humans in recorded history. By some estimates, between a few dozen and up to 150 men were killed by sharks over those days. The ordeal of the Indianapolis survivors stands as the deadliest shark attack on humans ever documented. Yet amid this hellish scene, acts of courage and resilience shone through. Men helped each other stay alive in whatever ways they could. They shared the last sips of fresh water from a found canteen. They took turns supporting comrades too weak to swim. Some, like 17-year-old Seaman Second Class Dick Thelen, found a reason to keep fighting. When I wanted to give up, I saw my dad's face, and I wasn't going to give up for him, Thelen said, remembering his promise to return home. In the face of almost certain death, most refused to go quietly. They fought the delirium, fought the sharks, fought to remain alive one more hour. Never, ever give up would become the survivor's mantra, words spoken decades later by Felton Outland, a sailor who survived that nightmare. Through 4 days and 5 nights, the men of Indianapolis hung on to life with unimaginable tenacity, even as their numbers dwindled with each sunset and sunrise. After nearly 5 days of living hell, the climax of this saga came with the rescue of the survivors, a moment of salvation as dramatic as it was long overdue. Around midday on August 2nd, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn's sighting had been the first spark of hope. As Gwynn circled overhead, the men in the water erupted in joyous chaos. "I hear a plane!" Marine Corporal Edgar Harrell shouted hoarsely on that 4th day. Those who could still move waved, splashed, and even prayed aloud in euphoria. Gwynn dipped his wings to signal he had seen them and began dropping life rafts, water, and supplies. Harold recalled how the plane initially flew past and nearly missed them, prompting the men to scream and splash in desperation. At the last second, the pilot banked around and rocked his wings, the sweetest signal the survivors had ever seen. "We began to pray. Everything," Harold said of that moment, his voice choking with emotion. One by one, through the late afternoon and night of August 2nd, the rescue operation expanded. The Catalina seaplane, piloted by Lieutenant Marks, now floating on the swells, became a beacon of hope as crewmen pulled survivors aboard. Marks radioed that so many were suffering that he was taking the unprecedented step of landing to save lives. Permission or not, he was already down. As darkness fell on August 2nd, the Cecil Doyle arrived and deliberately pointed its powerful searchlights straight up into the sky, a glowing lighthouse to guide other rescue ships to the area. Throughout the night, rescue teams worked frantically. Sailors and medics hauled emaciated, oil-blackened men out of the water. Many of the survivors were barely conscious, drifting in and out of hallucinations. It was often hard to tell who was alive and who was dead among the floating mass. Men had to be lifted gently to avoid killing them. Some were so weak that a rough grab could break their skin or limbs. At the height of the rescue, flares lit up the night, and small boats crisscrossed the area, plucking groups of survivors. The ocean that had been a void of despair for days was now teeming with reassuring lights and the sounds of human activity. Engines, voices calling out encouragement, the thunk of survivors being pulled into boats. Many rescuers openly wept as they tended to the men, horrified by the condition they were in. The survivors' eyes were sunken, their skin covered in thick oil and peeling away from sunburn. They were severely dehydrated. Some couldn't even speak, their tongues swollen in their mouths. In total, 316 men were rescued alive. One additional sailor survived the sinking but died immediately after rescue, bringing the often cited number to 316. When day broke on August 3rd, U.S. Navy vessels scoured the area for any last survivors, but by then, only bodies remained. Nearly 900 had gone into the water. Around 584 had died in those horrific 5 days. Survivors of the USS Indianapolis on Guam in August 1945, after rescue. Emaciated, covered in oil, and many barely conscious, the 316 rescued sailors were immediately given medical care for severe dehydration, hypothermia, shark-inflicted wounds, and saltwater poisoning. The Navy delayed announcing the loss of Indianapolis to the public for 2 weeks, until August 15, 1945, the day Japan's surrender was declared, virtually ensuring the news would be overshadowed. For the men who were saved, the ordeal was over, but a new battle was just beginning. They were shipped to naval hospitals on Guam and in the Philippines to recover. Many were in critical condition, drifting in and out of consciousness for days. Nurses had to pry their mouths open to give sips of water to mouths caked with oil. Some men were temporarily blinded by fuel oil or the sun and had to have their eyes bandaged. Others suffered from ghastly wounds or infections that set in during those days afloat. But they were alive. When the survivors first met Captain McVeigh on the hospital ship, they saluted him despite their condition. A moment filled with emotion as McVeigh broke down in tears, apologizing to his men. The rescued sailors soon learned that while they were fighting to survive, the world had moved on. Just a few days after their rescue, on August 6th and 9th, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the very weapons Indianapolis had helped deliver. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, officially ending World War II. In the midst of VJ Day celebrations, the Navy quietly released the news of Indianapolis's sinking. It was buried in the newspapers, largely overlooked by a world rejoicing that the war was finally over. The saga of the USS Indianapolis did not end with the rescue. It shifted to hospitals, inquiry rooms, and courtrooms, leaving lingering questions of military accountability and profound psychological scars. The survivors, once they recovered enough to travel, were sent home on leave. They returned to a country that largely had no idea what they had just endured. Their story was not widely known at first, suppressed under wartime secrecy, and then overshadowed by the war's end. Many of the young sailors struggled with severe post-traumatic stress. For a long time, they could not talk about what happened. Harlan Twible, the young ensign who had led a group of survivors, later admitted that for years after the war, he tried to forget the whole nightmare. He didn't even discuss it with his wife. It was simply too painful. Other survivors were tormented by survivor's guilt. Why had they lived while so many others died? And recurring nightmares. Even decades later, Indianapolis survivors reported that the trauma never fully left them. More than 68 years after their rescue, nightmares are common, wrote one reporter in 2013. Lowell Cox, a survivor, described a dream he has often. He's lost in a big city, searching anxiously for his buddies. He finds one, then loses him, then searches for another. An endless, futile hunt. "I suppose that means I'm back in the water again, looking for someone on my team," Cox explained of his subconscious horror. The psychological wounds ran deep for the men of Indianapolis, and healing was a slow, uneven process. Amid the survivors' private struggles, a very public controversy was brewing. The U.S. Navy, stung by the loss of Indianapolis and the egregious delay in rescuing her crew, looked for someone to hold responsible. In November 1945, just a few months after the sinking, the Navy convened a court-martial, an almost unheard-of action for a ship sunk by enemy attack. Captain Charles B. McVay III, who had commanded Indianapolis on her final voyage and survived, was put on trial. He faced 2 charges, failing to order abandoned ship in a timely manner and hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. McVay's own sailors were stunned. They considered him a victim of circumstance, not negligence. In their eyes, he had fought to save the ship and then shared their ordeal. But the Navy went forward with the trial. McVay was acquitted of the first charge. Everyone recognized there hadn't been time to properly abandon ship in the 12-minute sinking. On the second charge, however, he was convicted. The Navy declared that by not zigzagging at the time of the torpedo attack, McVay had hazarded his ship. This verdict was controversial from the start. In the court-martial, even the Japanese submarine commander Hashimoto was called to testify, and he stated that zigzagging would not have saved the Indianapolis, given how perfect his firing solution had been. McVay had in fact been sailing under orders that left zigzagging to his discretion, and he was not informed of any specific submarine threat in his path. Many felt that McVay was being made a scapegoat for larger failures higher up the chain of command. As later noted in Congress, of the hundreds of U.S. Navy captains who lost ships in combat during World War II, McVay was the only one court-martialed for it. The Navy perhaps sought to deflect blame from its own operational mistakes, like the failure to note the missing ship. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific commander, understood the injustice. He quietly remitted McVay's sentence and restored him to duty soon after. McVay was even promoted to Rear Admiral when he retired a few years later. But the damage was done. In the public eye, McVay was officially to blame for the tragedy of Indianapolis. Some families of the lost crew vented their grief and anger at him for years. "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son," read one cruel card McVay received. These personal attacks and the weight of guilt took a terrible toll. For decades, McVay carried the burden of being labeled the man who lost Indianapolis. In 1968, at the age of 70, Charles McVay died by suicide, a toy sailor from his childhood clutched in his hand. It was a heartbreaking coda to the tragedy. The captain survived battle in Sharks, only to become another casualty of the Indianapolis saga, driven by guilt and despair. It would take over 50 years for McVay's name to be cleared and the record set straight. In the late 1990s, an unlikely champion emerged, an 11-year-old boy named Hunter Scott, who chose the Indianapolis story for a school history project. Scott interviewed survivors and pored over documents, bringing fresh attention to the old injustice. Around the same time, survivors of Indianapolis, determined to honor their captain and shipmates, joined with Captain William Tody of the modern submarine USS Indianapolis, SSN 697, to lobby Congress for McVay's exoneration. The movement gained momentum, and in 1999, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings on the matter. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the former Japanese sub-commander, even wrote to support clearing McVay's name before he died in 2000. He Finally, in October 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution stating Captain McVeigh is exonerated for the loss of Indianapolis. President Bill Clinton signed it into law, and in July 2001, the Secretary of the Navy officially cleared McVeigh's service record of wrongdoing. It was a long overdue vindication. The surviving crew of Indianapolis, by then elderly men, rejoiced that their skipper's honor was restored. They had always known the truth. Now history would record it too. The story of the USS Indianapolis is one of heroism and horror, of a joyous mission's end transformed into a nightmare at sea. It remains the worst sea disaster in U.S. Navy history in terms of lives lost from a single ship. Yet, out of that darkness emerged powerful lessons about survival, accountability, and the human spirit. The Indianapolis crew's ordeal showed the extremes of what men can endure when pushed by fate. 4 days of living hell that tested not only their physical limits, but also their faith, loyalty, and will to live. Survivors later said it was their camaraderie and determination that kept them going. Thinking of family back home, as young Dick Thelen did, or finding strength in each other, as Twible's group did, made the difference between giving in and surviving. The survival instinct burned strong in those men. Even as sharks circled and death seemed certain, they refused to surrender. Never, ever give up was the lesson one survivor imparted to future generations. Their tenacity turned a potential total loss into 316 lives saved, each survivor a testament to extraordinary resilience. The Indianapolis tragedy also prompted critical changes in the Navy, ensuring that no ship's non-arrival would ever be ignored again. In direct response, the Navy implemented the Movement Report System, requiring constant tracking of ship movements so that no ship that fails to arrive in port goes missing without notice. This was a hard-earned improvement, paid for in the blood of Indianapolis's crew. It stands as a lesson in military accountability. The disaster was not solely the result of enemy action, but also of complacency and communication failure. Recognizing these failures has helped make subsequent generations of sailors safer. For the survivors, the decades that followed were marked by remembrance and healing. They formed the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization and gathered for reunions, finding brotherhood and understanding among the only other men on Earth who knew what they had been through. At these reunions, nightmares could be spoken of, tears shed, and also laughter shared. Telling their story became a mission to honor their 879 fallen crewmates and to educate the public. In fact, a pop culture moment unexpectedly brought their story to millions. The 1975 film Jaws featured a chilling monologue by a character who was an Indianapolis survivor, describing the shark attacks. That scene, delivered with haunting realism by actor Robert Shaw, reawakened interest in what had been a somewhat forgotten tragedy and indirectly set the stage for the push to exonerate Captain McVeigh. By the 1990s and 2000s, books, documentaries, and memorials finally gave the Indianapolis the recognition it deserved. In 2017, a research expedition funded by philanthropist Paul Allen located the wreck of Indianapolis on the Pacific floor, 18,000 feet down. The discovery, 72 years after the sinking, brought closure to some survivors and families. The ship was found resting peacefully, a war grave encrusted in deep-sea silence. In 2018, the crew of Indianapolis, living and deceased, were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors, in tribute to their sacrifice and service. Today, the USS Indianapolis National Memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana, stands etched with the names of those who sailed on her final voyage. Visitors who pause there can read the long list of names, 1,195 in total, and reflect on the magnitude of the loss and the courage of the survivors. The Indianapolis story resonates as a powerful narrative of psychological trauma and healing. It reminds us that war's casualties are not only those who die in combat, but also those who live with its ghosts. It prompts tough questions. How could the Navy have left those men adrift for so long? What burdens do leaders carry in wartime, and how do we assign blame in the chaos of combat? Ultimately, the exoneration of Captain McVeigh reaffirmed a principle of fairness and understanding, acknowledging that sometimes tragedies are not the result of one person's failure, but a convergence of cruel circumstances. As we remember the shark-infested night, we honor the men who faced the abyss with astonishing bravery. The legacy of USS Indianapolis is one of warning and inspiration. It warns us of the costs of complacency and poor communication. It inspires us with tales of men like Twible, who risked his life to lead others, Marks, who landed on the open sea to save strangers, and all the sailors who kept each other alive by sheer grit and faith. Their story is carved in history, never to be forgotten. Thank you for listening to the story of the USS Indianapolis. If this journey of courage and survival moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth documentaries on pivotal moments in history. We invite you to like this video and share it so that more people can learn about the heroism of the Indianapolis crew. Do you have thoughts on this incredible story or suggestions for other topics you'd like to see covered? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, remember to honor the past and those who lived it. Their experiences carry lessons for us all. Stay tuned for our next story, and thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and we'll see you in the next documentary. September 1966. A small fishing boat drifts along a remote Pacific island when the crew spots something uncanny, patches of burnt grass on sheer green cliffs. Then, out of nowhere, a wild-haired boy plunges from the rocks into the sea, followed by others yelling at the top of their lungs. Within moments, a teenager clambers aboard the boat and shouts in perfect English, "My name is Stephen. There are 6 of us, and we reckon we've been here 15 months." These 6 youths, long given up for dead, had somehow survived alone on an uninhabited island for over a year. This is the incredible true story of how 6 Tongan schoolboys, through teamwork, ingenuity, and unbreakable spirit, endured 15 months as castaways on a deserted island. It all began in June 1965 in the South Pacific Kingdom of Tonga. 6 teenage boys, Luke Veikoso, Stephen Tavita Fatai Latu, Sione Fatawa, David Tavita Siola A, Kolo Fekitoa, and Mano Sione Felipe Totau, were classmates at a strict Anglican boarding school in Nuku'alofa, the Tongan capital. Ranging from about 13 to 18 years old, they shared an adventurous spirit and a growing restlessness with regimented school life. Day after day, they toiled through prayers and plain meals at St. Andrew's School, dreaming of escape and exploring the wider world beyond their small island nation. Finally, the boys hatched a daring plan. They would borrow a boat and sail away to Fiji, or even all the way to New Zealand, hundreds of miles from home. They knew it was risky and barely made any preparations, just 2 sacks of bananas, a few coconuts, and a small gas stove. But youthful confidence and boredom drove them on. One evening, under the cover of darkness, the group snuck down to the harbor. There, moored at the dock, was a 24-foot wooden fishing boat belonging to a local fisherman named Taniela Uhila. The boys disliked Uhila and figured he wouldn't miss his boat until morning. Heart pounding with excitement, they untied the vessel and pushed off into the calm sea. A gentle breeze filled the sail as they left behind the twinkling lights of Nuku'alofa, giddy with the thrill of freedom. None of them imagined the peril that lay ahead. Their ill-planned adventure took a dark turn that very first night. Hours after departure, the weather abruptly shifted. A fierce tropical storm rolled in, the wind howling and waves towering in the darkness. Rain pelted down as the boys struggled to control the boat. In their inexperience, they failed to lower the sail in time. The gusts tore it to shreds, and soon the rudder snapped off as well. The little boat was now utterly at the mercy of the storm. Lightning flashed, and the young crew huddled in terror as their stolen vessel was tossed about. At some point, the anchor line parted, leaving them adrift on the open ocean. Water poured in with each wave, and the boys frantically bailed with their hands, fighting to keep the craft afloat through the long, chaotic night. When dawn broke, the storm had blown itself out, but the 6 teenagers found themselves lost at sea, sails and rudder gone, utterly disoriented. For the next 8 days, the group drifted aimlessly across the vast Pacific with no land in sight. Under the searing tropical sun, they quickly ran out of their meager food and fresh water. Parched with thirst, they used tin cans to catch any rainwater they could whenever a rare drizzle fell. Some of the boys began to cry in despair. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. By the 6th and 7th days adrift, they were extremely weak and dehydrated. They took turns scooping out seawater leaking into the hull, trying to keep hope alive. "I was worried we might die," Mano recalled of that desperate time. Still, the tight-knit friends encouraged each other to hold on. They prayed together on the cramped boat, asking for salvation in the empty ocean. On day 8, as the sun climbed on the morning horizon, one of the boys cried out, "Land!" Sure enough, a faint outline of an island appeared far in the distance. With no means of steering, they let the winds and currents carry them slowly closer over the course of that day. By nightfall, the raft-like wreck was approaching the island's rocky shore. The place was Ata, a volcanic speck about 100 miles from where they'd set out. Unbeknownst to the boys, Ata was uninhabited. It had been abandoned a century earlier after a devastating episode in Tonga's history. In 1863, a Peruvian slave ship had raided Ata, kidnapping the island's entire native population. Since that dark day, the island stood deserted and largely forgotten. Now, in 1965, fate had led 6 starving castaways to this forbidden refuge. Late that night, the damaged boat struck an outer reef off Ata's coast and began to break apart. The exhausted teens knew they had to get to shore, but jagged rocks and churning surf made it perilous. Mano Totau, the oldest at about 18, took charge. Despite his own fatigue, he volunteered to go first and secure a safe landing. "We have to say a prayer first," Mano told his friends, and together in the dark they offered a final plea for protection. Then, Mano plunged into the Black Sea. He fought through strong currents and crashing waves, making for the faint outline of the beach. Every stroke was agony. He was so weak from 8 days without food or water that the whole world seemed to spin around him. At last, his feet touched sand. Collapsing on the shore, he tried to stand, but his legs failed. Still, he managed to pull himself up beyond the tide line. He felt dry grass under his fingers and cried out as loud as he could back toward the boat. "I'm here! I made it!" Hearing Mano's shout, the others mustered their remaining strength. One after another, the 5 boys abandoned the wreck and swam for their lives, clinging to bits of floating debris. It took all night and well into the next day for all of them to reach land. Some only managed by clutching planks from the disintegrating boat and paddling ashore over many hours. But by the next evening, miraculously, all 6 friends stood together on the shores of Ata Island, alive. They were skeletal, sunburnt, and dehydrated, but alive. Overjoyed and relieved, the first thing they did as a group on solid ground was kneel in the sand and say a prayer of thanks for surviving the sea. The immediate concern now was basic survival. The boys had nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs, and some had even lost those to the waves, and a few remaining scraps salvaged from the boat. That first night on the island, desperate for water, they managed to catch a seabird and drink its blood to slake their burning thirst. They also found a few seabird eggs to swallow raw. These provided just enough sustenance to keep them from collapse. For shelter, they dug out a small cave in the sand and earth by hand, burrowing into a hillside to escape the elements. Huddled together in their makeshift cave, the 6 castaways collapsed into a deep sleep for the first time in over a week, the sound of the ocean surf roaring outside. They had escaped the storm and the sea, but now found themselves marooned on a deserted island with an uncertain road to survival ahead. Dawn on their first full day on Ata brought a mix of hope and harsh reality. The morning sun revealed the island to be rugged but lush. Ata was a volcanic island ringed by steep cliffs and rocky beaches with a high forested plateau at its center. The castaway boys awoke sore and thirsty, but thankful to feel solid ground beneath them. Their immediate priority was water. Mano led the group inland, climbing up toward the dense green interior in search of fresh water or edible plants. As they scrambled up the slope, barefoot and weak, Mano stepped on a piece of soggy wood on the ground. Instinctively, he lifted it and squeezed water from the wet wood into his mouth. the first fresh water any of them had tasted in 8 days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spur them onward. Reaching the top of the island, the boys gazed out over the tree canopy and the endless ocean beyond. In that moment, despite their hunger and uncertainty, they felt a surge of hope. They were alive on dry land, and that alone was a blessing after their ordeal at sea. Reality set in quickly. There were no other humans on this island to help them. They truly were on their own. If they wanted to survive, they would have to rely on their wits and each other. Gathering everyone together, the teenagers agreed to work as a team and face this challenge with determination. They remembered stories of Robinson Crusoe and survival skills they'd heard about. Right away, they began dividing tasks amongst themselves, a pattern that would define their stay on Atta. In their new world, water was life. The boys soon discovered that rainwater was their best hope for a steady supply. Using their hands and sharp rocks, they hollowed out the trunks of palm trees to make rustic cisterns. Whenever rain fell, the natural bowls would fill, yielding precious fresh water that they guarded carefully. For times when rain was sparse and their reserves ran low, the castaways resorted to extreme measures. They continued to hunt seabirds on the cliffs, not only for meat, but also for fluid. On a few desperate occasions, they had to drink the blood of seabirds to stay hydrated, a grisly practice, but one that likely saved their lives when no other water was available. Food was another constant concern. At first, the island seemed barren of easy food. There were no fruit trees by the beach, and certainly no stocked pantry. So the boys turned to the ocean and the island's wild flora and fauna. With impressive ingenuity, they crafted makeshift tools from the debris of their wreck and the island's resources. They fashioned fish hooks from scrap metal and spears from sharpened sticks, and became adept at fishing in the coastal shallows. The surrounding sea was teeming with life. Before long, they were pulling in fish, catching crabs and crayfish, lobsters by hand at low tide, and even trapping seabirds for meat. On land, the boys foraged whatever edible plants they could find. Luckily, Atta had been left untouched by humans for decades, which meant nature had flourished. In one stroke of fortune, they stumbled upon wild stands of taro root, a starchy, potato-like plant high in calories, likely descendants of crops once planted by the island's former inhabitants. With no pigs or people to dig them up in all those years, taro roots were abundant in the forests. The boys dug them up and learned to roast or boil them once they had fire, turning taro into a dietary staple. After a few days, they also found papaya trees and coconut palms, enjoying the tropical fruits and vital nutrients they provided. The biggest breakthrough in their food quest came about 3 months into their stay. As the group grew stronger, they decided to explore deeper into the island's interior. Climbing for 2 days through dense jungle and up into the high crater at the center of Atta, the boys made a stunning discovery: the overgrown ruins of an abandoned village. This was Colomail, the ghost village left behind after the 1860s slave raid. Among the remnants of long-ago habitation were banana trees laden with fruit, untended but still thriving, and clusters of feral chickens clucking in the underbrush. It must have felt like stumbling into a lost Eden. The boys realized these chickens were likely descendants of domestic fowl that had been living wild since the island was evacuated over a century earlier. With some effort, they managed to catch the feral chickens, providing them with a new source of meat and eggs. They also started tending a small garden in the fertile volcanic soil, planting some wild taro cuttings and banana shoots to increase their food supply. By reviving the old village gardens of Colomail, the resourceful teens transformed their situation. From mere scavengers, they became settlers on the island, coaxing sustenance from the land itself. One of the Tongan castaways sits atop a cliff on the deserted island of Atta in 1966, scanning the horizon. The boys often climbed high points like this, watching for any ship that might pass by and rescue them. During those first weeks, one of the hardest challenges was living without fire. At night, temperatures dropped and they had no reliable way to boil water or cook the taro and fish they gathered. The 6 boys knew they needed fire for long-term survival, so they never stopped trying to start one. Day after day, despite weakness and failure, they persisted, using a traditional method they'd heard of: the fire plow technique, rubbing a hardwood stick vigorously in a groove of soft wood to generate an ember. Finally, after what they later estimated was 3 months on the island, their hard work paid off. Stephen, who would later become an engineer, succeeded in coaxing a tiny ember to life using 2 sticks. The spark was nurtured into a flame, and for the first time the castaways enjoyed a hot meal of cooked fish and roast taro, a feast hard won after months of cold foraging. From that moment on, the fire became their most treasured possession. The boys kept it burning continuously for over a year, never once letting it go out during their entire exile. Tending the fire became a rotating duty, day and night, rain or shine. The fire provided warmth, boiled their drinking water, cooked their food, and even served as a constant signal for help, its smoke visible to any passing ship. On cliffsides, they burned patches of grass to attract attention from afar. That persistent column of smoke would eventually be one of the clues that led to their salvation. With food and fire slowly under control, the teenagers turned to creating a proper shelter. They refused to live like animals. They wanted a home on the island. Using only their hands, rocks, and an old knife blade from the wreck, the boys cut down branches and gathered wide palm fronds. Under Kolo's guidance, he was particularly skilled in traditional crafts, they painstakingly wove coconut palm fronds into panels of thatch. It took Mano about 2 weeks to weave enough palm mats for walls. They selected a flat spot and built a hut from scratch. Sturdy tree trunks formed the frame, palm thatch became the walls and roof, and they even engineered an indoor fire pit for cooking. For bedding, they cut large banana leaves and piled them thickly to make soft mattresses on the hut floor. In the end, their shelter was snug and water-resistant, capable of withstanding the tropical rainstorms and the cyclone season's gales. At night, as rain drummed on the thatch roof, the 6 friends could huddle around their warm fire inside the hut, sharing stories and comfort. In a very real sense, they turned the wilderness into a home. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the boys' survival was how they formed a miniature society that emphasized order, mutual respect, and support. Early on, they realized that chaos or conflict could be deadly in their situation, so they agreed on rules to keep everyone working together. They split into pairs, with each pair assigned specific responsibilities on a rotating schedule. For instance, 2 would tend the garden and gather fruit, 2 handled cooking and fire maintenance, and 2 stood guard to watch for ships or handle any urgent needs. This division of labor ensured that every boy had a purpose each day, and no one was overburdened or left idle. The 2 oldest boys naturally took on leadership roles. One became the group's informal captain for practical matters, organizing work, making repair plans, while the other acted as a spiritual and emotional leader, leading prayers and keeping morale up. Together, these youthful leaders provided stability and direction, but all decisions of importance were discussed among the group. It was a cooperative effort at heart. Maintaining emotional health was as important as finding food. To combat loneliness and fear, the boys established comforting rituals. Every morning and evening, they would gather to pray together, asking for strength and eventual rescue. They also found solace in music and games. Using what little they had, the boys even managed to construct a crude guitar, more like a ukulele, a piece of driftwood for the body, half a coconut shell as a sound box, and steel wires from the boat for strings. With this makeshift instrument, they sang songs under the stars at night. In fact, they composed 5 original songs during their 15-month stay. Singing and harmonizing in their native Tongan language helped keep their spirits up through the long, dark nights. They played games and even crafted a form of a gym to stay fit. Using a sturdy branch and heavy stones, they set up a bench press station to exercise, turning survival into a sort of daily routine that included recreation. In short, they nurtured not just their bodies, but also their minds and hearts, warding off despair with friendship and faith. To survive 15 months in isolation, the Tongan castaways relied on a combination of clever resourcefulness and solid teamwork. Some of their most ingenious strategies included capturing water. They carved out hollow tree trunks to catch and store rainwater, creating natural cisterns that provided a steady drinking supply. During droughts, they weren't above using coconut fluid or even seabird blood as emergency hydration. They foraged wild taro roots and tropical fruits like papaya and coconut to supplement their diet. Discovering the old village's banana grove and feral chickens allowed them to start a mini farm, tending a garden and keeping captured chickens for eggs and meat. Surrounded by ocean, the boys became skilled fishermen. With homemade hooks and spears from scrap metal and wood, they caught fish, lobsters, and shellfish to eat. On land, they set traps for seabirds and hunted the island's birds, using every part for nourishment, even drinking raw eggs and blood when needed. Once they succeeded in making fire by friction, they never let it die out. The fire burned day and night for over a year, giving them cooked food, safe water, warmth, and a continuous smoke signal to attract rescue. With no modern tools, they built a sturdy hut from palm fronds and wood to shelter them from rain and tropical cyclones. They also dug latrines and enforced strict cleanliness around their camp, understanding the importance of hygiene to prevent disease. They organized themselves into teams and shared duties evenly, whether it was guarding the fire, harvesting food, or scanning the sea for ships. A rotating schedule kept everyone busy and accountable, leaving no room for boredom or dissent. Remarkably, the 6 teenagers resolved disputes with maturity far beyond their years. If tempers flared or an argument broke out, they instituted a rule. The quarreling parties had to separate and cool off at opposite ends of the beach. After a little time apart, they would reunite and talk through the issue calmly. This simple time-out system kept their camp harmony intact, preventing small disagreements from exploding in the high-stress environment. The group sustained not just their bodies, but their humanity. They even held makeshift funerals for any birds they had to kill for food, a gesture of respect that helped them remember their values. They supported each other emotionally, praying, singing, and joking together daily to fend off depression. This camaraderie and empathy were as crucial to survival as any bushcraft skill. One dramatic example of their cohesion came a few months into their stay. One of the boys, Stephen, slipped and fell from a cliff, badly breaking his leg. It was a grave situation. A severe injury in such conditions could easily turn fatal. But the other 5 immediately sprang into action. Drawing on basic first aid knowledge, they improvised a splint using sticks and leaves to set Stephen's leg. They fashioned crutches for him and took on his duties while he healed. Over the following weeks, the group made sure Stephen was never left alone. They brought him food, kept him clean, and encouraged him daily. Incredibly, the broken leg mended true. Stephen recovered fully under his friend's care. This episode showcased the boys' ingenuity in medicine and, more importantly, their devotion to one another. Had they not worked together selflessly, Stephen might not have survived his injury. But on this island, each boy's life was entrusted to the others, and they never forgot that. Despite their impressive adaptation, life on Atta was far from easy or pleasant. The boys endured fierce tropical storms that lashed the island, hunkering down in their cave or hut as wind and rain hammered the cliffs. They experienced gnawing hunger when supplies ran short or fishing was poor. There were days of intense homesickness when the reality of their isolation sank in. "We were not happy where we were," Mano admitted later of their mental state. No matter how beautiful the island or how bountiful their garden, nothing could replace the comfort of family or the security of civilization. Some evenings, one of them would break down in tears missing their parents, or wondering if anyone out there even knew they were alive. During those low moments, the others provided comfort, a hand on the shoulder, a shared prayer, or a rousing song to lift spirits. Hope was their most important sustenance. "I lived in the hope that something would happen, that something good would come tomorrow," Mano reflected of that time. Day after day, the 6 friends reassured each other that eventually they would go home. At one point, about a month into their castaway life, the boys attempted a bold escape plan. Restless and eager to take fate into their own hands, they decided to build a raft and try to sail for help. They spent days chopping down large trees, using fire to weaken the bases, and lashing logs together with vines. When the crude raft was ready, they pushed it into the surf and climbed aboard, hoping the currents might carry them to a populated island. But the sea had other ideas. The raft was battered by waves and began to come apart almost immediately, forcing the boys to abandon it and swim back to shore before they were dragged out to sea. Disappointed but alive, they recognized that escape by their own means was too dangerous. After that, they doubled down on surviving on Otta and keeping a signal fire burning, resigning themselves to wait for rescue by chance. It was a hard lesson in patience. They had to trust that someday someone would stumble upon them. And so the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months. The changing seasons brought cooler weather, then heat, as 1965 rolled into 1966. Through it all, the 6 castaways maintained their remarkable little community. They celebrated Christmas 1965 together on the island, likely marking the holiday with a prayer and perhaps a special treat of bananas or roast bird if they had it. They lost exact track of time, but they never lost sight of their shared goal: get everyone home alive. Their hair grew out into wild manes, and their clothes tattered away until they mostly wore makeshift loincloths or went nude island style. Yet in their hearts they remained the same polite, church-going Tongan boys they had been taught to be. Each night before sleeping, they sang a hymn or softly hummed a lullaby from back home. Unbeknownst to them, back in Tonga, their families had long since feared the worst. Funerals were held for the missing boys after search efforts failed. The community mourned their loss, and even the King of Tonga made a note of the tragedy of the lost schoolboys. Only Mano's father, as Mano later learned, refused to believe his son was gone. He held out hope in his heart that somehow Mano was still alive out there. That faith would prove justified. By the late summer of 1966, the castaways had endured an astonishing 15 months on the island. They did not know it had been that long. To them, it felt like time had blurred. They only knew it had been a very long time, perhaps over a year. They had settled into a routine but never stopped scanning the horizon. Then, one fateful day, their vigil was rewarded. On September 11, 1966, the boys were going about their usual tasks when one of them, Stephen, thought he spotted an unfamiliar object on the water's edge. As he looked harder, his heart leapt. It was the sight of a ship's mast and a tiny plume of smoke on the horizon. A boat. A boat was approaching Otta. He shouted to the others, and together the 6 climbed to a high vantage point. Sure enough, there was a small fishing vessel cautiously circling the island's coast. Excitement and anxiety exploded among the group. After over a year of isolation, was this finally salvation, or were their eyes deceiving them? Down on that fishing boat, the crew had indeed noticed signs of life on the supposedly uninhabited island. The vessel was an Australian fishing boat named the Just David, captained by Peter Warner, and they were in Tongan waters hunting for lobster. Captain Warner had passed by Ada when he noticed burned patches on the green cliffs, an odd sight on a deserted island that made him curious. Drawing nearer, he saw smoke and what looked like human figures on the beach. Warner's crew initially hesitated. They had heard stories that sometimes convicts or pirates were marooned on remote islands. Could this be a dangerous trap? The boys on shore, with their matted hair and scant clothing, looked wild and ragged. Unsure what to expect, Warner approached carefully. Then, before the fishermen could even launch a dinghy, one of the castaways dove straight into the sea and began swimming frantically toward the boat. It was Stephen. Despite having broken his leg months before, he was now strong and determined, cutting through the water with powerful strokes. Behind him, the other 5 stood on the rocks, jumping and whooping for joy, calling out in English that they were from Tonga. Captain Warner peered through his binoculars at the spectacle. Naked teenagers with long, bushy hair yelling at the top of their lungs. Unsure whether to be alarmed or elated, he had his crew stand by with rifles just in case, but allowed the first swimmer to come alongside. Stephen, reaching the Just David, pulled himself up the rope ladder and onto the deck. Soaking wet and trembling with emotion, the boy looked Captain Warner in the eye and spoke the words the captain would never forget. "My name is Stephen. There are 6 of us, and we reckon we've been here for between 1 and 2 years. Warner was stunned. The story sounded unbelievable, yet here stood the proof in front of him. Within minutes, the rest of the boys had swum out and clambered aboard. The crew quickly realized these were not hostile castaways, but desperate survivors, extremely excited and speaking polite English. The boys, out of breath and overjoyed, insisted they were students from Nuku'alofa who had been lost at sea since 1965. To verify their claims, Captain Warner grabbed his two-way radio. He took down the boys' names, Mano, Stephen, Kolo, David, Luke, and Sione, and radioed the operator in Nuku'alofa, Tonga's capital. "I have 6 boys here," he reported. "They say they've been shipwrecked on Ata for over a year." There was a long pause on the other end. 20 minutes went by as the castaways and the crew waited anxiously for a reply. Those minutes felt like hours. Finally, the radio crackled back to life. The operator's voice was tearful and astonished. "You found them. These boys have been given up for dead. Funerals have been held. If it's really them, this is a miracle." Upon hearing this confirmation, a wave of emotion rolled over everyone on deck. The 6 rescued youths laughed, cried, and hugged one another, and the bewildered but moved fishermen. "I could not explain how we felt. We were all full of tears, happy, like we walked through heaven," Mano later said of that miraculous moment. After 15 months of praying for deliverance, their prayers had been answered. Once it was clear the boys were indeed legitimate missing persons, Captain Warner's crew welcomed them fully. They hauled the tired teenagers aboard properly, giving them food, water, and clothes or blankets to cover themselves. Amusingly, after so long on island fare, the boys had trouble digesting the rich Western food. Their first meal on the Just David made a couple of them sick until their stomachs readjusted. But that was a small hiccup in an otherwise euphoric reunion. Warner was amazed at the boys' condition. Despite their ordeal, they were healthy, strong, and in good spirits. Aside from a few scars and the one mended broken leg, they had no serious ailments, a testament to how well they had managed their survival. Before departing the area, Captain Warner took Stephen and a couple of the boys back to retrieve what they could from Ata. The 6 castaways guided the fishermen up to their campsite, proudly showing them the neat little world they had built, the fire still crackling in its pit, the huts, the gardens of taro and bananas, even a long-forgotten cooking pot they'd found and used. One can only imagine the crew's astonishment at seeing how these teenagers had not only survived, but truly lived on this island, recreating a semblance of civilization. The boys gathered a few keepsakes, perhaps their handmade guitar or a journal if they had one, and then said goodbye to their island home. For all the hardships it had brought, Ata had kept them alive and forged an unbreakable brotherhood among them. The Just David then set sail for Nuku'alofa, carrying the rescued boys back to their people. As the boat neared Tonga's capital, word spread like wildfire. The wharf was crowded with anxious family members, villagers, and officials, eager to see this impossible homecoming. When the 6 young men stepped ashore, a tremendous cheer and wailing of joy erupted. Mothers, fathers, siblings rushed to embrace them, tears streaming. They were sons returned from the dead. The entire country rejoiced. In a time before instant news, this rescue was a sensation passed from person to person, a rare, joyous miracle. The boys later recounted that the celebrations in their honor lasted for 3 days straight. One day of feasting and thanksgiving was hosted by their families, another by their church community, and a third by local island authorities. Everyone wanted to fete the heroic youth who had survived against all odds. The King of Tonga himself reportedly greeted them and thanked Captain Warner personally. Banners were hung, church choirs sang hymns of gratitude, and a special service of thanksgiving was held for the boys' safe return. It was likely the happiest moment of their lives. Yet amid the celebrations came a startling reminder of the boys' youthful mischief. Within days of their return, the 6 were arrested and briefly jailed in Nuku'alofa. The charge? Stealing the boat back in 1965. The boat's owner, Mr. Uhila, whose vessel they had indeed taken and wrecked, was furious about his loss and insisted on pressing charges despite their incredible story. It was a sour note after such a miraculous survival. When Captain Peter Warner heard that his young friends had failed to show up to a welcome party on his boat because they were sitting in a jail cell, he took action. Determined to help the boys who had come to trust him, Warner negotiated a deal with Tonga's authorities and Mr. Uhila. Warner arranged with Australia's Channel 7 television network to buy the exclusive rights to the Castaways story for the sum of £150, around $200 in 1966 value. He turned over this money to Mr. Uhila to pay for a new boat. Presented with compensation, the fishermen agreed to drop the charges, and the 6 boys were released. In effect, their freedom was purchased by the retelling of their adventure. Channel 7 wasted no time. Within weeks, a TV crew flew to Tonga to document the astonishing tale of survival. They even sailed back to Atta Island with the boys and Captain Warner to film a reenactment of key moments. The result was a television documentary titled The Castaways, aired in October 1966, that captivated audiences in Australia. Black and white footage shows the boys, fit and smiling, demonstrating how they climbed the cliffs, started fire, and lived on the island. This early documentary turned the Tongan castaways into minor celebrities and helped recoup some money for them and for Warner through media appearances. Captain Warner, for his part, had grown very fond of the 6 lads. He saw potential in their seafaring skills and camaraderie. After their rescue, he offered them jobs as crew on his fishing boat. Amazingly, all 6 accepted. The boys who had once run away to see the world now had a legitimate chance to do so. Under Warner's mentorship, they spent the next few years crewing aboard a new fishing vessel, which Peter Warner reportedly named the Atta after their island. This unexpected turn fulfilled the boys' original teenage dream, to escape Tonga and have an adventure. Now they sailed to Fiji, Australia, and beyond, working, earning money, and seeing the wider world under the guidance of the very man who had saved them. In gratitude for saving the boys, Tonga's king Taufa Hautupu IV granted Peter Warner a special royal concession to harvest lobsters in Tongan waters, an enormous gesture of thanks that helped Warner's fishing business and cemented his friendship with the kingdom. More meaningfully, Warner's relationship with the 6 former castaways deepened into genuine familial love. He became a close friend, even a father figure, especially to Mano Totau, who later said, "He's like a father to me," when speaking of Warner. The bond forged in those extraordinary circumstances lasted a lifetime. In the decades after 1966, each of the 6 Tongan castaways went on to live full lives. Some emigrated to Australia or New Zealand, others stayed in Tonga. They rarely spoke publicly of their ordeal. It was a profound, even traumatic memory that they shared mostly among themselves. Mano Totau, for example, settled quietly in Australia and didn't seek fame or attention. It wasn't until years later, in the 2000s, that their story resurfaced globally and drew renewed interest. A Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman, wrote about the castaways as a shining example of human cooperation in his 2020 book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. Media outlets picked up the real Lord of the Flies angle, drawing contrast with William Golding's famous novel, which these boys' story starkly contradicts. Suddenly, more than 50 years after the rescue, the surviving castaways found themselves in the spotlight again. Mano Totau, at age 73, gave interviews in 2020, astonished that people around the world were so fascinated by what he and his friends had endured as teenagers. With the renewed fame, some controversies emerged. Members of the Tongan and Pacific Islander community voiced concerns that early retellings of the story focused too much on the white Australian rescuer's perspective, Peter Warner, instead of the voices of the Tongan survivors themselves. They noted that accounts often glossed over or cursory mentioned the painful history of slavery that left Atta deserted, a history deeply significant to Pacific Islanders. In Bregman's article, for example, the 1863 slave raid on Atta was referenced only briefly, which some felt downplayed the gravity of that tragedy that set the stage for the boys' experience. Others pointed out that Captain Warner had profited from selling the rights to the boys' story back in 1966 to fund the boat repayment and later, and they questioned whether it was right for an outsider to benefit from a very Polynesian story of resilience. For his part, Mano Totau strongly defended his captain and friend. He publicly said he did not begrudge Warner any money made from the story. "If not for Mr. Warner, we never survive. If he makes some money from it, good luck to him. Please, everybody, shut up," Mano said bluntly in response to Warner's critics. To Mano, what mattered was that Warner had saved their lives and remained a loyal friend. Still, Mano expressed his own desire to eventually tell the full story in his own words, perhaps by writing a book, so that he could pass something on to his grandchildren and ensure the Tongan perspective was preserved. Today, the legacy of the 6 Tongan castaways lives on as an inspiring example of human cooperation and resilience. Their story has been featured in books and documentaries and even caught Hollywood's eye. In 2020, a major film studio acquired the rights to develop a feature film about their adventure. Decades later, one of the survivors, Kolo Fekitoa, actually returned to Ata with an explorer for a short stay, reliving the survival experience for a new documentary. But most of all, the tale of these 6 boys has traveled the world as a beacon of hope. In an era rife with stories of conflict and self-interest, here was a real-life case where friendship, faith, and teamwork allowed a group of children to overcome extreme adversity. It challenges assumptions about how people might behave in desperate situations and shows that even young people, when given no other choice, can organize themselves with astonishing wisdom and care. The climax of this story was not a dramatic battle or tragic end, but a joyful reunion, the moment the boys were found and brought home safely. Unlike many castaway tales of history, this one did not end in tragedy or violence. Instead, it built to a climax of pure human joy and relief. Families reunited, an island kingdom celebrating, and 6 boys embarking on the rest of their lives forever bound by an incredible chapter they wrote together. The conflict they overcame was nature itself, hunger, thirst, isolation, and they defeated it through unity and ingenuity. In reflecting on the saga of the Tongan castaways, one cannot help but feel a sense of awe. These were schoolboys, mere teenagers, yet they managed to do something many seasoned adults might fail at: survive completely alone in the wild for over a year with no training or tools, and all 6 made it out alive and well. Their story is a testament to the strength of community and cooperation. When one boy was down, the others lifted him up. When resources were scarce, they shared everything equally. When disagreements occurred, they found ways to resolve them peacefully for the greater good. Far from descending into chaos, they built a society of hope and order on that lonely island. Their instinct was not to turn on each other, but to care for each other, and that made all the difference. Historically grounded and true, this account stands as a hopeful counterpoint to fictional tales of castaways turning savage. In the face of dire circumstances, these 6 youths proved that compassion and collaboration can triumph over fear and desperation. They kept their humanity intact, even at times showing empathy for the animals they had to kill to survive, and in some ways came out of the ordeal better people than when they entered it. As Mano reflected later in life, "When I think back to our time on the island, I realize we really learned a lot. I think I learned more on the island. I learned how to trust myself, and that if you're in a real problem, you will eventually see what you need to do to survive." Their unintended adventure taught them self-reliance, resilience, and the power of friendship, lessons that no classroom could have imparted so vividly. 50-plus years later, the surviving members of the group, now elders in their 70s, still share a special bond. They are living witnesses to an extraordinary event that has inspired countless people around the globe. The Tongan castaways' 15-month journey is more than just a survival story. It is a profound reminder of human beings' capacity for goodness and cooperation under extreme pressure. In a world often focused on conflict, their experience shows that with unity, ingenuity, faith, and a bit of luck, ordinary people, even children, can achieve the extraordinary. If this inspiring true story of survival and friendship moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more documentary-style deep dives into remarkable historical events. Share this story with others to spread the message of hope and resilience. What do you find most astonishing about the Tongan castaways' ordeal? Is it their ingenious survival skills, their unwavering teamwork, or something else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember to cherish the power of cooperation and human spirit in your own life. A lone sailor drifts on a tiny inflatable raft in the middle of the Atlantic. His skin is blistered by the sun, his body weak from hunger and thirst, and circling shadows beneath the waves hint at sharks. 76 days have passed with no land in sight. This is not a scene from a movie. It's a true survival story unfolding on the open ocean, where one man's will to live is tested beyond all limits. In 1982, 29-year-old Steve Callahan set out on what was supposed to be a dream voyage, a solo transatlantic sail on a boat he built himself. An experienced sailor and boat designer, Callahan had already crossed the ocean once and was eager for another adventure. But fate had other plans. Just a week into his journey, in the dead of night, an unseen force struck his small sloop Napoleon Solo. The hull was pierced and water began flooding in like fire hoses, forcing Callahan into a fight for his life. How did he end up alone on a life raft, and what did it take to survive 76 days adrift at sea against impossible odds? This documentary will dive into the harrowing voyage of Steve Callahan, a true tale of ingenuity, endurance, and the indomitable human spirit. The story begins calmly on January 29, 1982. Steve Callahan departs the island of El Hierro in the Canary Islands, plotting a 3,000-mile course to Antigua in the Caribbean. He is utterly in his element, the sea. Callahan's vessel, a 21-foot sloop he had named Napoleon Solo, was one he lovingly designed and built himself. Sailing solo across vast ocean stretches had been his childhood dream, and now he was living it. The first days are smooth sailing, warm sun, steady winds, and nothing but rolling blue horizons. But on the seventh night, as a gale lashes the Atlantic, disaster strikes. Sometime near midnight, Callahan is jolted awake by a deafening bang against the hull. In an instant, icy seawater gushes into the cabin. He scrambles to orient himself in the darkness, heart pounding, as the boat's bow is stove in by an unknown object. Later, he would suspect it was a whale or perhaps a large shark that collided with the hull. Water surges below deck at an alarming rate. As Steve later described it, water was thundering over me as the Napoleon Solo began to sink beneath him. Callahan is flooded with adrenaline and terror. For a brief moment, he feels a surreal detachment. There was even a camera mounted on his boat to document the journey, and in the chaos he has a darkly ironic thought that it's capturing dramatic footage no one will ever see. Then, survival instinct kicks in. He has only minutes, maybe seconds, before the sailboat is lost to the depths. In total darkness and rising water, Steve gropes for his emergency ditch bag and life raft. The life raft, a circular rubber inflatable about 6 feet across, is his last refuge, but it won't help unless he can grab supplies. With the boat foundering, Callahan makes a split-second decision. He dives into the flooding cabin to retrieve anything that might keep him alive. Holding his breath, he plunges underwater inside his own sinking yacht, feeling his way in the cold, murky space. On one dive and then another, he grabs at critical items: a spear gun, some packets of food and cans of provisions, a few flares, his sextant and navigation charts, an emergency kit, even a tattered sleeping bag. Each time he resurfaces, gasping, inside the tilted cabin, the water level's higher. One by one, he hauls the supplies into the life raft bobbing beside the sinking hull. By the time he clambers into the inflatable raft, exhausted and soaked to the bone, Napoleon Solo is almost completely submerged. He cuts the raft's tether line with a knife, instinctively trying to remain attached to the mothership for as long as possible. It still feels like a lifeline in the endless sea. Night wears on with furious winds and towering waves. Callahan huddles under the flimsy canopy of the raft, a 6-foot rubber circle now tossed about by the storm. Inside this little bubble of air and rubber, water sloshes at his ankles. He bails constantly with an old tin can to keep from swamping. Each wave threatens to flip or shred the raft. He's in nothing but a t-shirt and shorts, shivering and wide-eyed with fear. In the blackness, he can barely make out the silhouette of his beloved sailboat still tethered nearby. Hours pass in an exhausting blur of bailing and praying. Then, just before dawn, a large breaker hits. Snap. The rope tying the raft to the sinking sloop parts in the roaring surf. When the gray morning light arrives, Steve Callahan is utterly alone. The Napoleon Solo is gone beneath the waves, and he and his raft are now drifting free in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 800 miles west of the Canary Islands. All is quiet after the storm. Callahan sits in shock, watching the empty horizon. The reality settles on him heavily. He is adrift with only the scant supplies he managed to grab. He takes inventory of his situation. By some miracle of grit and luck, he salvaged a small emergency kit containing a few food items, a flashlight, some flares, fishing tackle, and crucially, 3 solar stills, simple devices meant to produce fresh water from seawater. He has a spear gun and some basic tools. For food, there are a few cans and scraps, some nuts and raisins, a half-eaten cabbage, a can of baked beans, a bit of chocolate, maybe a couple of eggs, hardly a feast. Worst of all, his fresh water supply amounts to just a pint, about 8 ounces, barely a half-liter of water. Under the tropical sun, that water might last him a few days at most. The stark truth is horrifying. Unless he can catch rain or make water, dehydration will kill him before hunger ever does. In those first hours and days on the raft, Steve battles waves of regret and self-recrimination as much as he battles the elements. He is a skilled sailor caught in a nightmare scenario that sailors dread. Now, with nothing around him but empty horizon and the endless heaving ocean, his mind churns through every mistake he's made in life. He thinks of his recent divorce, of business ventures that failed, of friends and family he fears he'll never see again. Guilt and sorrow weigh on him. As he later admitted, he felt he had failed at human relations generally, at business, and now even at sailing. This crushing emotional state is something he calls the recoil, the whiplash after the immediate crisis where one confronts the reality of disaster and personal failures. For about 2 weeks, alone with his thoughts, Callahan wrestles with despair. The life he knew has been swept away, and he is faced with the monumental question, how do I survive? Every morning, Steve forces himself to push aside panic and focus on survival tasks. Routine becomes his salvation. In the cramped raft, he establishes a daily schedule to maintain his sanity. Check the raft for damage, tend the solar stills, fish for food, navigate, exercise as best he can, and record everything in his logbook. Yes, he decides to keep a journal on scraps of paper, documenting each day's progress or setbacks. It's a way to impose order on chaos and to remind himself that time is still moving. With a pencil stub, he even charts his drift using a bit of ingenuity. Among the few tools he salvaged is a plastic sextant, but it's rudimentary, so he improvises one out of pencils and whatever he has on hand. By measuring the angle of the North Star above the horizon each night, he begins to estimate his latitude. It's an exercise in hope, plotting his likely westward drift with the currents, imagining where this unwanted voyage might carry him. Fishing quickly becomes a make-or-break skill for survival. In the beginning, Callahan struggles to catch anything, and he is clumsy with the spear gun in a raft that's constantly moving. The ocean, however, provides in unexpected ways. Flying fish occasionally hurl themselves onto the raft at night, startling him awake as they flop around, but providing precious protein when he grabs and eats them. Soon, larger fish appear in the raft's wake. A pair of mahi-mahi, dorado, begin shadowing his raft, curious about this odd object in their domain. Using his spear gun and sheer patience, Steve manages to spear a mahi-mahi, a major triumph that provides several meals of raw fish flesh. Over time, an entire ecosystem develops around the drifting raft. Barnacles cling to the underside, small fish nibble at the growth, bigger fish chase the small fish. Callahan becomes a part of this floating food chain. He learns to spear not only mahi-mahi, but also triggerfish, and even the occasional bird that lands, lost at sea like him. On one occasion, he succeeds in catching a sea turtle hatchling or a small shark, demonstrating the resourcefulness or desperation of a man determined not to starve. He eats everything raw and bloody right there in the raft. There is no way to make fire, and though it's unpleasant, each bite keeps him alive. I spent the next 2.5 months learning to live like an aquatic caveman, Callahan would later say. In a sense, he becomes the wild creature he must be, living off raw fish and rainwater, half naked under the sun, surviving day to day. Water, however, remains the most critical worry. Surrounded by undrinkable salt water, Steve's only lifelines are the solar stills and whatever rain squalls might bless him. The solar stills are clever but primitive devices, basically inflatable clear plastic cones that use sunlight to evaporate seawater and collect a bit of fresh water each day. Callahan has 3 of them, but they are an early prototype model from World War II, and he has no instructions. In his first days adrift, he can't get them to work properly. He even sacrifices one still by taking it apart to understand the mechanism. Through trial and error, he finally coaxes the remaining stills into operation. Each day, under the ruthless sun, they yield just a trickle of water, on average a bit over a pint total, around half a liter per day. It's barely enough. Steve remains chronically parched, his tongue often sticking to the roof of his mouth. Whenever a rain shower passes, he frantically spreads anything he can, cups, tarp, his own clothes, to catch the precious raindrops. Those brief tropical downpours are holidays for him, moments where he can drink his fill and even allow himself a shower by rinsing the salt off his skin. But such moments are few. Most days, the sky is a merciless blue furnace and fresh water a constantly rationed treasure. Through all of this, dangers lurk around and within the raft. Sharks become an occasional terror. In the stillness of the night, Steve sometimes hears them, the soft brush of a body against the raft bottom or a telltale dorsal fin slicing the moonlit water. Once or twice, a shark bumps the raft, sending a bolt of fear through Callahan's spine. He readies his spear gun, heart pounding, imagining a shark's teeth puncturing his fragile vessel. Although he has a number of encounters with sharks, some of them pretty scary, he notes that thankfully he wasn't plagued by them constantly. Still, the knowledge that large predators glide just beneath his flimsy rubber raft keeps him alert and uneasy. He even manages to kill a small shark for food at one point, but the act is harrowing and risky. More often than not, man and shark simply eye each other in a wary standoff in the empty sea. Days turn to weeks. Callahan drifts westward on the currents, roughly following the equatorial flow that pushes from Africa toward the Caribbean. To keep himself sane, he talks aloud to the ocean and the creatures around him. The mahi-mahi that follow the raft become his companions in an odd way. He even gives names to a couple of the fish, recognizing their patterns and quirks. They are both food and friends. He feels a kinship with them as fellow survivors of the sea's vast wilderness. They became a sort of spiritual center for me, he would later reflect. These bright green and gold fish, always gliding beneath him, are a reminder that he is not entirely alone. Life teems around him, even if human help is nowhere to be found. Every dawn on the raft brings a glimmer of hope, and every sunset, a descent into gnawing despair. Around day 14, 2 weeks into his ordeal, Callahan spots the silhouette of a ship on the horizon. It's the first sign of civilization he's seen since losing his own vessel. His heart surges. Fumbling in excitement, he grabs a flare. As the ship comes closer, or rather, as he drifts nearer to a shipping lane, he ignites the signal. A red flame sputters into the daylight sky, and thick smoke coils upward. Steve waves frantically and shouts into the void. For a moment, it seems the ship alters course. Did they see him? He allows himself to imagine rescue. But the large vessel does not stop. In horror, he realizes it's continuing on, plowing over the horizon and leaving him behind. They never notice the tiny life raft in the vast ocean swells. Despair sets in deeply that night. That ship was his best chance, and it vanished. Still, in the following days, he refuses to give up. In total, Callahan will spot 9 ships during his drift, most of them large freighters or tankers in the distance. On at least a few occasions, he sets off flares or mirrors the sun at them, but not a single ship comes to his aid. By roughly 1 month adrift, he has drifted through the main North Atlantic shipping lanes without rescue. The realization is chilling. He truly cannot count on being spotted. The world's shipping traffic has not saved him, and now he is leaving those busy lanes for the emptier reaches of the Western Atlantic. From the beginning, Steve had told himself he must rely on self-rescue, and now that is more true than ever. There is no Deus ex machina coming. He will have to survive as if no one is looking for him at all. Physically, the toll of weeks at sea is devastating. The sun is unrelenting, blistering his exposed skin by day and baking the air inside the canopy. Salt crystals from evaporated seawater encrust his clothing and skin, causing agonizing saltwater sores wherever they form. His lips crack and bleed. His eyes are bloodshot from the glare. Salt and sun conspire to make his entire body one continuous ache. At night, temperatures drop and he shivers under his damp sleeping bag, only to be woken by spray or the occasional fish flopping aboard. Hunger gnaws at him constantly, though it's somewhat blunted after the first few weeks as his body adapts. His face grows hollow and his muscles waste away from caloric deficit. The constant thirst is worst of all, a torment that fills his every waking thought. Surrounded by water he cannot drink, he dreams of fountains and cold beers and tall glasses of iced tea. Sometimes those dreams are so vivid that he wakes with a start, tongue thick, and nearly dips his hand in the ocean to drink before sanity returns. The line between reality and hallucination blurs at times, especially under the glaring sun, and yet, amid this suffering, there are moments of profound beauty and clarity. Drifting under a dome of stars at night, Steve witnesses sights few ever see. Phosphorescent plankton turn the waves into fields of sparkles with each raft movement. The Milky Way is a ribbon of light unspooling above him. In his log, he writes of one particularly clear, moonless night where the stars reflected on the ocean surface, surrounding him in starlight above and below. He later described that view as a view of heaven from a seat in hell, the heavens in all their glory, observed from the most punishing circumstances on the ocean below. These awe-inspiring nights give him a strange comfort. They remind him that he is part of a bigger universe, even if he feels so small and forsaken. It is as if the ocean itself is both tormentor and companion, a character in this story, by turns savage and serene. By the 5th week, around day 35, Callahan's body is weak and his morale weaker. He has been alone for over a month, longer than he ever thought possible. Every morning he still dutifully checks his position and the condition of his raft. Based on the stars and sun, he believes he's drifting west and a bit north, which theoretically should take him toward the Caribbean. But that destination is thousands of miles away. The raft is holding up reasonably well so far, a credit to its design and to Steve's constant care. He routinely inspects its seams and reinflates any soft chambers with a hand pump. Each day is a precarious balancing act of rationing. Eat too little and he might not have strength to fish. Eat too much and he'll exhaust his meager food stores early. He combats his mental fog by doing small exercises, leg lifts, stretching, anything to keep his muscles from atrophy and to give a sense of purpose. When depression and hopelessness threaten to overwhelm him, he forces himself to focus on just one task. Prioritize the biggest problem, solve it, then move to the next. This mindset of breaking the overwhelming ordeal into small, achievable goals keeps him from mentally unraveling. As he will later note, survival was about taking things one step at a time, small, achievable steps to the eventual goal. Even so, by the end of the 2nd month adrift, Steve is nearing his breaking point. The cumulative strain on his mind and body reaches a crisis on day 50. Around that time, catastrophe nearly strikes the life raft itself. One morning, Callahan awakens to find a corner of the raft sagging dangerously. A sharp object, Perhaps a fish spine or a barnacle has punctured the raft's outer layer, causing an air chamber to slowly leak. Horror grips him. If the raft deflates or sinks, he will have no shelter at all in the open ocean. Over the next days, the small tear grows into a gaping rip in part of the raft's floor. Seawater seeps in. Steve fights back with everything he has. For 10 excruciating days, he is engaged in a near-continuous battle to keep the raft afloat. He uses his pump frantically to replace the leaking air and bails water around the clock. Sleep becomes a luxury. He can only collapse in exhaustion for minutes at a time before the urgent need to pump or bail wakes him. This period is pure nightmare. Callahan is weak as it is, and now he's expending precious energy in a race against drowning. Each sunrise finds him still pumping, the hole not yet fixed, his body running on fumes. At his lowest ebb, after days of futile struggle with the raft's leak, Steve finally loses hope. It is now around day 60, and he hasn't had proper rest in days. One hot afternoon, dehydrated and delirious, he pauses his incessant pumping. The rubber floor is sloshing with water. The raft is sagging and half deflated on one side, despite all his efforts. His hands are covered in blisters from working the pump, and his arms feel like lead. Looking around at the endless horizon, something inside him cracks. He breaks down in tears, sobbing under the pitiless sun. In his log or memory, he later notes that he essentially gave up in that moment. It seemed inevitable that the raft would fail completely, and he would slip under the waves, ending his torment. Perhaps, he thinks grimly, that might be a mercy. But as the daylight fades on this darkest of moments, a survival instinct deeper than conscious thought reignites within Steve Callahan. In the silence, he becomes terrified of dying, truly afraid that if he falls asleep or lets exhaustion win, he will drown in his raft, and no one will ever know or find him. That fear shocks him back to action. With trembling hands, Steve rummages through his kit for the repair materials included in the life raft's emergency supplies. There, he finds a tube of rubber cement and some patches. Summoning strength he didn't know he had left, he carefully cleans the area around the tear and applies a patch to the raft's inner bladder. His hands shake as he smooths it down and waits, praying it will hold. The repair isn't perfect, but it starts to slow the leak. He reinforces it with every bit of glue and fabric he can find, working methodically through the dusk and into the night, illuminated only by faint starlight and sheer determination. When he finally gets the upper hand on the leak, Callahan feels a surge of triumph like nothing before. He has overcome the impossible, patched the raft, and saved his own life with minutes to spare. "It felt like the biggest victory of my life," he would later say of that moment. Indeed, in his waterlogged, half-starved state, managing to fix the raft is an act of pure resilience. The climax of his struggle has passed. He refused to surrender when death was at the door. In the aftermath, a kind of calm falls over him. The raft, though scarred and weary like its occupant, is stable again. From this point on, Steve enters what he calls the hanging-on phase. He has patched the raft, but now he must simply endure whatever time remains until either rescue comes or his body fails. Each day, he watches the minutes tick by on his wristwatch, amazingly still functioning. Time becomes at once his enemy and his comfort, an enemy because it brings prolonged suffering, a comfort because every passing minute survived is 1 minute closer to a potential rescue. His routine becomes even more Spartan. He moves as little as possible to conserve energy. The ocean, as if spent from testing him, offers periods of eerie calm. The sunrises and sunsets blur together in their beauty. He continues to catch fish when he can, though he's so weak now that the effort of pulling in a thrashing mahi-mahi leaves him gasping. He's lost a tremendous amount of weight, his bones protrude and his muscles have wasted. He estimates later that he's lost a third of his body weight, dropping down to around 100 pounds from his normal 150. Each movement feels like lifting stones. Worse, in the final stretch of his ordeal, Steve's solar stills begin to fail. After so many weeks of use, the flimsy devices degrade, Perhaps the membranes tear or they grow fouled with salt. One by one, they stop producing even that meager pint of water a day. Callahan scrambles to repair them, but finds it increasingly difficult to coax any fresh water out. The timing couldn't be worse. He's in the hottest waters yet, nearing the tropics, and his body is at its weakest. By early April 1982, roughly day 73 or 74, he is down to his last cans of water, just 3 little cans that together might hold a liter or two. He knows it might be all the water he has before the end. After that, if no rain falls and the stills are kaput, dehydration will finish what the sea and sun started. Steve writes a farewell message on a scrap of paper, an epitaph of sorts, a final note in case by some miracle his raft is found without him. He is preparing himself for the very real possibility that he will die out here, alone, on this raft that has carried him so far. On what he believes to be day 75 of his drift, just before dusk, a new sight catches Callahan's sunken eyes, a faint glow on the horizon. At first he thinks he's hallucinating again, but as the sky grows dark, he sees it more clearly, a flashing light far to the west. It looks like the blinking pattern of a lighthouse. Could it be? He is astonished. If it's a lighthouse, that means land must be near. Around the same time, he also notices changes in his environment. Birds are appearing more frequently, different species than the lonely pelagic birds he'd occasionally seen in mid-ocean. These seem like coastal birds, suggesting he's nearing islands. Earlier that day, he even spotted the contrail of an airplane high overhead, the first plane he'd seen in over 2 months. That, too, hints that he might be approaching civilization once more. These signs kindle a last spark of hope in Steve's heart. He doesn't know it, but he is approaching the Caribbean islands. In fact, the light he sees on the 75th night is from a lighthouse on Marie Galante, a small island just southeast of Guadeloupe in the French West Indies. After 1,800 nautical miles of drifting westward, he is finally closing in on land. On the morning of April 20th, 1982, the sun rises on Steve Callahan's 76th day adrift. He feels the raft bobbing in a gentle swell and hears an unusual sound, the squawking of many seabirds. When he peers out from under the raft's canopy, he sees that a flock of birds is circling and diving nearby. They are attracted to the sea life around his raft, the little ecosystem of fish and barnacles that has trailed him faithfully. Steve's raft has inadvertently become a beacon for the food chain, and now it's drawing not just birds, but something else. In the distance, he hears a faint putter of an engine. With a jolt of excitement, he spots a small boat on the horizon heading in his direction. They're not coming for him, he realizes. They're likely local fishermen, following the flock of birds, hoping to catch the fish beneath. But they are coming this way. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Callahan pulls on his last remaining clothes. He had long since stripped down to almost nothing, to protect his skin and because of the heat, but now, mindful of decency, he dons his one tattered t-shirt and even fashions a sort of loincloth out of a triangular bandage to cover himself. He must look a wild sight, gaunt, bearded, skin covered in sores, eyes bulging with anticipation. As the small wooden fishing boat draws closer, Steve waves his arms weakly and manages to whistle or shout. The fishermen, drawn by the odd spectacle of hovering birds, suddenly notice something bobbing in the water. They see an orange raft and, incredibly, a human figure waving. One of them exclaims in surprise. Within minutes, the boat pulls alongside the life raft. Steve Callahan is rescued, plucked from the sea by 3 fishermen off the coast of Marie Galante. It is exactly 76 days since the Napoleon Solo sank. The fishermen are astonished. At first, they can hardly believe this emaciated, sun-scorched man is real. One of them later said they weren't sure what to make of the apparition in that raft. Steve, barely holding himself upright, manages an exhausted smile and perhaps the words "thank you" in English. Fortunately, one of the fishermen speaks a bit of English, and they quickly move him onto their boat, giving him water and the safety of solid craft beneath his feet. For Callahan, the moment is overwhelming. He has been saved by the very ecosystem of fish and birds that grew around him. In the end, the fish brought my salvation, he notes, since the fisherman followed the birds that were following the fish near his raft. It is, as he wryly puts it, one grand fish tale with a perfect ending. As the reality sinks in that his ordeal is over, Steve lies in the bottom of the fishing boat, looking up at the blue sky he knows so well, and allows himself at last to relax. Tears of gratitude mix with the crusted salt on his face. The fishermen bring him to shore, the island of Marie-Galante. Villagers and local authorities, shocked and intrigued by this sudden castaway, rush to assist. Steve is so weak he cannot walk without help. Months of near starvation have left his legs atrophied. They take him to a small local hospital where doctors are amazed he is alive at all. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, down to about 100 pounds. Yet aside from the numerous infected saltwater sores in his weakened state, he is largely intact. A nurse gently tries to remove the filthy, shredded t-shirt from Steve's body, the same shirt he'd been wearing for weeks. The odor is so overpowering that she lifts it away with 2 fingers, as if it were toxic. Steve later jokes that he never saw that t-shirt again after they whisked it off to be burned or thrown away. After just an afternoon of tests and rehydration in the hospital, Callahan, ever independent, insists he's well enough to leave. By that evening, he steps outside under his own power, albeit shaky, to feel firm ground beneath his feet and to breathe the sweet, humid air of land. In the days that follow, as he regains strength, Steve learns just how incredible his navigation by drift was. He ended up only about 100 miles from his original destination of Antigua. He had essentially drifted into the general vicinity of where he had aimed to sail. The raft that was his home, a 6-foot Avon inflatable life raft, is later recovered and eventually ends up displayed in a maritime museum in Massachusetts as a testament to his survival. Callahan spends a few weeks recuperating on Marie-Galante and nearby islands, slowly reintroducing his body to food and walking. In less than 2 months, remarkably, he is able to sail again, hitching rides on yachts through the West Indies to make his way home. The sea, which nearly killed him, is still his pathway home. Steve Callahan's 76-day ordeal at sea is not only a tale of survival, but also of transformation. Facing nearly 12 weeks of isolation and mortal peril, he emerged with a newfound perspective on life and the ocean. He described his nights alone under the stars as seeing a view of heaven from a seat in hell, a poetic reflection of finding beauty amid suffering. Despite enduring starvation, dehydration, and despair, Callahan has said he does not regret those 76 days on the raft because the experience changed him for the better. It taught him profound lessons in self-reliance, the value of life, and humanity's bond with nature. Even after coming so close to death, Steve did not turn his back on the sea. He continues to sail the world's oceans, calling them the world's greatest wilderness, and has inspired countless others with his memoir, Adrift. His story stands as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the ingenuity one can summon when pushed to the brink. Adrift at Sea, 76 Days Lost in the Atlantic, is a true survival story that speaks to our deepest fears and our highest hopes. If Steve Callahan's incredible journey moved or inspired you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories of human survival and adventure. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember to hold on to hope, even in life's most desperate moments, because you never know when salvation may appear on the horizon.